There's something quietly reassuring about simple things, especially the ones you've known your whole life. Honey is one of them. You've seen it in jars, stirred into tea, drizzled over food. It feels familiar, almost ordinary. But when you slow down and begin to notice what honey actually is, something subtle begins to shift in your mind. Because honey isn't just a sweet substance, it's a result of patience, precision, and quiet natural intelligence. And as you start to understand it, your thoughts tend to slow down as well. Think about how honey begins, not in a factory, not in a rush, but inside a small, highly organized world, where thousands of bees move with a kind of silent agreement. Each bee has a role, each movement is purposeful. Nectar is collected in tiny amounts, drop by drop, from flowers that may only bloom for a short time. And what's interesting is this: a single bee might visit hundreds of flowers just to gather a small portion of nectar, not enough to notice on its own. But over time, those small, repeated efforts accumulate quietly, without urgency, without pressure, and eventually, that becomes honey. There's something calming about that idea, because it reminds you that not everything meaningful happens quickly. Some things naturally take time. As the nectar is brought back to the hive, it isn't immediately honey. It's still too watery, too unstable. So the bees begin a slow process of transformation. They pass the nectar between each other, breaking it down, refining it, reducing its water content. Then, something even more subtle happens. They fan their wings gently, creating airflow that slowly evaporates the remaining moisture. No force, no sudden change, just a gradual shift from liquid nectar into thick, stable honey. And what's fascinating is this: honey is one of the very few natural foods that doesn't spoil. Under the right conditions, it can last for thousands of years. Jars of honey have been found in ancient tombs, still preserved, still edible. That kind of stability is rare. And when you think about it, your mind begins to mirror that quality, a sense of stillness that doesn't easily break. There's also something interesting about the way honey interacts with your body, not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, steady one. Honey contains simple sugars, primarily glucose and fructose, which are already broken down. So when you consume it, your body doesn't have to work hard to process it. It's absorbed slowly, gently, without sharp spikes. And that slow release of energy can create a kind of quiet balance. Not a rush, not a sudden burst, just a steady, predictable flow. Even the brain responds to that steadiness, because your mind often reflects the patterns happening inside your body. When energy arrives slowly, your thoughts tend to follow that same rhythm. There's another layer to this. Honey is often described as natural, but that word can feel vague, so it helps to look a little closer. Honey is essentially concentrated sunlight, captured through flowers, transformed by bees, and stored in a form that your body can recognize instantly. It carries traces of its origin, the environment, the plants, the season. No two types of honey are exactly the same. Each one is slightly different, depending on where it came from. And that quiet uniqueness can shift how you think about it. It stops being just a sweetener. It becomes a record of time and place, a slow process captured in a small space. When your mind starts to follow these details, something subtle happens. Your attention narrows, not in a forced way, but naturally. You move away from scattered thoughts and toward a single, simple idea. And that simplicity is often enough to quiet the noise, because the mind doesn't always need silence. Sometimes it just needs something steady to rest on, something that doesn't demand too much, but still holds your interest. Honey does that in a quiet way. It gives your thoughts something to follow, slowly, without tension. There's also something grounding about the scale of it all. Bees don't rush. They don't try to finish quickly. They repeat small actions over and over with consistency. And in a world that often feels fast and unpredictable, that kind of rhythm feels different. It feels stable, predictable, almost reassuring. And when you notice that your own thoughts may begin to slow down just a little, not because you're trying to relax, but because you're observing something that already is. As you sit with this idea, the process becomes clearer. Honey is not about speed. It's about accumulation, tiny moments, small actions, repeated patiently, until something stable forms. And maybe that's why thinking about it, especially at night, has this quiet effect. It gently shifts your attention away from urgency and towards something that unfolds, slowly, naturally, without pressure. And as that idea settles, you may notice your thoughts becoming less scattered, not completely still, but softer, less demanding, more spaced out, like the steady movement of bees, moving without noise, without rush, guided by something simple and consistent. Honey doesn't try to calm your mind. It simply exists in a way that makes calm feel natural. And sometimes, that's enough. Just a simple idea, held gently until your thoughts begin to follow it, without effort. And if you stay with that idea a little longer, another layer begins to reveal itself. It's not just the final form of honey that feels calming. It's the quiet predictability of how it behaves. If you've ever watched honey being poured, you may have noticed the way it moves. Slow, continuous, unbroken. It doesn't splash or scatter. It folds into itself, forming soft, looping shapes as it settles. That movement is not random. It's a reflection of its structure, its thickness, its internal resistance to sudden change. And there's something about watching that kind of motion, even imagining it, that brings your attention into a slower rhythm, because your mind tends to imitate what it observes. When you think about fast, sharp things, your thoughts become quick and fragmented. But when you focus on something that moves slowly, steadily, your thinking begins to stretch out, becoming less rushed, less crowded. Honey doesn't hurry, so your mind, for a moment, doesn't feel the need to hurry either. There's also a quiet kind of order hidden inside honey. Even though it looks simple, it's actually composed of a very precise balance of sugars, enzymes, and trace elements. Bees introduce enzymes that begin breaking down complex sugars into simpler ones. That transformation isn't visible to you, but it's always there, working beneath the surface. And this is where something interesting happens psychologically. When you become aware of hidden processes, your attention deepens. You begin to think in layers, not just what something is, but how it became that way. And that kind of thinking naturally slows the mind, because it replaces surface-level noise with quiet curiosity. Instead of jumping from thought to thought, you begin to follow one idea, a little further than usual, just enough to feel grounded in it. Another detail, often overlooked, is how little water honey contains. Most bacteria and microorganisms need moisture to survive, but honey holds very little free water. It creates an environment where growth is limited, almost paused. And this absence of excess, this reduction, is part of what keeps it stable. There's a subtle parallel here. When there is less extra, less noise, less clutter, things tend to settle. The same can be true for your thoughts. When attention is not scattered across too many directions, when it isn't overloaded with constant input, it naturally begins to organize itself, not by force, but by lack of disturbance. Honey holds itself together because nothing unnecessary is allowed to take over. And in a quiet way, your mind can recognize that pattern. If you look at a honeycomb, the structure becomes even more precise. Each cell is a near-perfect hexagon, not by design in the human sense, but by natural efficiency. The hexagon allows bees to store the maximum amount of honey using the least amount of wax. No wasted space, no excess effort, just a form that works, repeated over and over again. And there's something deeply calming about patterns like that, because your brain is constantly searching for order. When it finds something structured, consistent, predictable, it stops trying so hard to make sense of things. It can rest just a little. Even imagining rows of hexagons, evenly spaced, quietly holding golden honey, can create a sense of mental alignment, not forced, just gently suggested. You might also notice how honey interacts with time in a different way. Most foods change quickly. They spoil, decay, lose their structure. But honey resists that. It remains stable, almost unchanged, for long periods. And when you think about that, time begins to feel less urgent, less pressing, because not everything is constantly slipping away. Some things hold their form. They stay. They remain intact, even as everything else moves forward. That idea alone can soften the sense of pressure that often builds during the day, the feeling that everything must be done quickly before it's too late. Honey quietly suggests something else, that stability is possible without rushing. There's also the sensory memory attached to honey. The taste, warm, soft, slightly floral. It doesn't overwhelm the senses. It lingers gently, then fades, and your brain tends to associate that kind of experience with safety, with calm environments, with moments that didn't demand urgency. So even thinking about the taste of honey can bring back that same quiet response, not because of the flavor itself, but because of the patterns your brain has stored around it. Simple, predictable, non-threatening, and your mind responds to that by lowering its intensity just slightly. If you follow this idea further, you begin to see how small, stable systems influence your internal state. Honey is not loud. It doesn't compete for attention. It doesn't demand focus. It simply offers a consistent, understandable pattern. And when your mind encounters something like that, it doesn't need to stay alert in the same way, because there's nothing unexpected to react to, nothing sharp or sudden, just continuity. And continuity tends to quiet the need for constant thinking. At this point, your attention may already feel a little different, not completely still, but less scattered, more focused, without effort. And that shift didn't come from trying to relax. It came from following something steady, something that unfolds slowly, without requiring anything from you. That's often the simplest way the mind begins to settle, not by force, but by alignment. You give it something calm to observe, and it gradually begins to match that pace. There's one more detail that often goes unnoticed. Honey crystallizes over time. It becomes thicker, more solid, forming small, fine crystals throughout. This isn't a sign that it's gone bad. It's just another phase, another stable form. And even that process happens slowly, quietly, without interruption. The structure shifts, but the essence remains the same. And there's something reassuring in that idea. That change doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it's just a different kind of stability. As you sit with these thoughts, they don't rush you anywhere. They don't ask you to do anything. They simply continue in a steady, predictable way. And your mind, in response, may begin to loosen its grip on faster thoughts, not because you're pushing them away, but because they no longer match the pace of what you're focused on. So the idea of honey, in all its quiet detail, becomes something more than information. It becomes a rhythm, a slow, continuous pattern that your thoughts can follow. And as they follow it, they naturally become softer, more spaced, less urgent, nothing forced, nothing abrupt, just a gradual shift toward something steady, something that holds and doesn't rush to change. And if you let your attention rest there a little longer, the stillness in honey begins to feel less like a property and more like a quiet principle, something that repeats itself across many layers if you look closely enough. Because honey is not just slow in how it moves, it is slow in how it forms, slow in how it stabilizes, and even slow in how it changes. There is no single moment where nectar suddenly becomes honey, no clear boundary where one state ends and another begins. It's all gradual, and that gradual nature is something your mind understands deeply, even if you don't always notice it. Because many of your own thoughts don't arrive all at once either. They build, they shift, they soften over time. And when you observe something like honey, you begin to recognize that same process happening within you. You might start to notice how often the mind looks for sharp transitions, clear answers, immediate results, defined endings. But honey offers none of that. It exists in between liquid and solid, between fresh and preserved, between movement and stillness. And instead of feeling incomplete, it feels stable in that in-between state. That's a quiet contradiction, one that gently challenges the idea that everything must be clearly defined before it can feel settled. Sometimes, the mind becomes quieter when it allows things to remain slightly unresolved, not confused, just not forced into clarity too quickly. Honey holds that kind of balance. There's also something to notice in how honey interacts with light. When you look at it, especially in a still moment, you can see how it catches and softens what passes through it. Light doesn't bounce sharply off its surface. It diffuses, spreading gently, creating a warm, muted glow. That soft interaction changes how you perceive it. Edges become less defined, transitions become smoother, and your eyes, in response, relax their focus. They don't need to track sharp contrasts or sudden shifts. They can settle into something continuous, and your mind often follows that same visual cue. When what you see is gentle, your thoughts tend to become gentle as well. Even the color of honey carries a certain quiet consistency. It stays within a narrow range, gold to amber, sometimes darker, sometimes lighter, but never extreme. There are no sudden jumps, no unpredictable variations, and your brain tends to respond well to that kind of limited spectrum because it doesn't need to constantly adjust. It doesn't need to recalibrate or stay alert for change. It can remain steady, observing something that stays within familiar boundaries. That kind of visual predictability often translates into a calmer internal state, not because it forces calm, but because it removes the need for constant adaptation. If you follow this further, you may begin to notice how honey quietly resists disruption. If you stir it, it moves, but slowly returns to stillness. If you tilt it, it shifts, but holds together. It doesn't scatter easily. It doesn't fragment under small disturbances. And that resilience is not loud or dramatic. It's quiet, almost unnoticeable, unless you're paying attention. But once you do, it becomes clear, and your mind, in observing that, may begin to mirror it in a subtle way. Thoughts still move. They still shift, but they may begin to hold together more instead of breaking apart into smaller, faster pieces. There's also the idea of containment. Honey is often stored, held within a space, a jar, a comb, a small, defined boundary. And within that boundary, it remains stable. It doesn't try to expand beyond its container. It simply fills the space it's given. And there's something quietly grounding about that, because the mind often does the opposite. It stretches outward, reaching into the past, the future, distant possibilities. But when it focuses on something contained, something self-held, it gently returns to a more limited space, not restricted, just more focused, more present. And that kind of containment often reduces the sense of mental drift. At this point, the pattern becomes more noticeable. Honey is not calming because it tells you to relax. It's calming because it demonstrates a set of conditions: slowness, stability, continuity, soft transitions, quiet resilience. And your mind, without being instructed, naturally aligns with those conditions when it observes them closely enough. It doesn't require effort. It doesn't require control. Just attention. Sustained, gentle attention. As your focus remains here, you may also notice how your sense of time begins to adjust. Moments feel slightly longer, less compressed, not because time itself changes, but because your perception of it becomes less hurried. And that shift often happens when your attention is no longer divided, when it's resting on something that doesn't push it forward too quickly. Honey doesn't rush you to the next idea. It allows each detail to unfold fully before moving on. And your mind, in following that rhythm, begins to experience time in the same way. There's a quiet completeness in that, a sense that nothing is missing, even in stillness, that you don't need constant input, constant change, constant movement to feel engaged. Sometimes, a single steady idea is enough to hold your attention, enough to gently organize your thoughts, enough to reduce the need for anything more. And as this continues, the edges of your thinking may feel softer, less defined, not unclear, just less rigid, more fluid, like the honey itself, moving when it needs to, resting when it doesn't, without forcing either state. So the facts about honey, the slow formation, the careful balance, the quiet resistance to change, they begin to form a kind of mental environment, one that doesn't demand anything from you, one that simply exists consistently and allows your thoughts to settle within it. And in that environment, there's less pressure to move quickly, less urgency to resolve everything at once, more space between thoughts, more room for stillness without needing to call it that. Honey doesn't create silence. It creates a pattern that makes silence easier to reach, a steady presence that your mind can follow until it no longer feels the need to wander as far. And as you remain with that, just a little longer, the idea stays simple: slow processes, quiet structures, gentle consistency, all working together without effort. And your thoughts gradually begin to do the same, not all at once, not completely, but enough to feel the difference. A soft shift towards something more stable, more continuous, and quietly at rest. And if you stay with this idea just a little further, something subtle begins to happen in the background of your attention. The concept of honey stops being just information. It starts becoming a reference point, a quiet mental anchor your thoughts can return to without effort, because your mind naturally organizes itself around patterns it can trust. And honey, in its structure and behavior, offers exactly that kind of reliability, not through intensity, but through consistency, not through stimulation, but through predictability. There is something important in that distinction, because much of modern thinking is shaped by interruption, rapid shifts in attention, constant changes in input, unfinished threads pulling in different directions. And in that kind of mental environment, clarity often feels harder to reach, not because the mind is incapable of it, but because it rarely gets a stable surface to rest on. Honey represents the opposite of that condition. It is not fragmented. It does not compete with itself. It does not split its behavior across multiple directions at once. It remains cohesive, and that cohesion is part of what makes it so quietly stabilizing to think about. Even its formation process reinforces that idea. Nothing in honey is abrupt. Every transformation happens through repetition. Enzymes acting slowly, water evaporating gradually, layers building over time. Each step is simple on its own, but together they form something complex without ever becoming chaotic. And that is an important kind of intelligence found in nature. Complexity without noise, structure without tension, change without instability. When your mind observes that kind of system, even indirectly, it often begins to reorganize itself in response, not consciously, not deliberately, but in a more subtle way. It starts to prefer continuity over fragmentation. It begins to hold on to thoughts a little longer before moving on. It becomes less reactive to the need for constant mental switching, and in that slower rhythm, something interesting appears, a sense of internal spacing, gaps between thoughts that were not noticeable before. Those gaps are not empty in a negative sense. They are simply less crowded, less occupied, and within them, awareness feels less pressured to fill every moment with interpretation or analysis. It can just remain present, observing without immediate direction. Honey, in a strange way, represents that same principle in physical form, a substance that has already completed its transformation, a substance that does not rush to become anything else. It simply remains what it is, stably. And that stability can feel quietly grounding to the mind, because it contrasts so sharply with mental overactivity. There is also something worth noticing about how honey is received by the body. It does not require preparation. It does not demand complex digestion in the way heavier substances might. It integrates smoothly, quietly, without disruption. And while that is a physical process, your mind often translates physical ease into psychological ease. When something feels simple for the body, the mind often mirrors that simplicity. It reduces unnecessary alertness. It lowers its need to monitor every small detail. This is part of a larger pattern in human perception. The brain is constantly responding not only to meaning, but to rhythm, to pace, to flow. And honey carries a very distinct rhythm: slow formation, slow movement, slow change. Nothing abrupt enough to trigger urgency, nothing unstable enough to create alertness. So when you think about honey in detail, you are not just thinking about a food substance, you are engaging with a model of continuity, a demonstration of how stability can exist without rigidity, how slowness can exist without stagnation, how transformation can occur without disruption. And that kind of thinking tends to quiet the internal sense of urgency, because urgency often comes from the perception of instability, from the feeling that things are moving too quickly to be fully understood. But honey does not move quickly. It does not challenge your ability to follow it. It remains accessible to slow observation, and that accessibility changes the tone of your thinking. Even the way honey preserves itself adds another layer to this. It does not rely on external intervention to remain stable. It protects itself through its own composition: low moisture, high sugar concentration, natural antibacterial properties. It is self-sustaining in a very quiet way. And that idea can subtly influence how you think about stability itself. That not all stability requires effort. Not all preservation requires control. Some systems remain balanced simply because of how they are structured. And when your mind engages with that idea, it often relaxes its tendency to overmanage thoughts, to constantly adjust, to constantly monitor. It begins to accept that some processes can unfold on their own without interference. There is also a sensory imagination that comes with honey that is worth noticing. Even if you are not physically experiencing it, the mind can reconstruct its texture: thick, slow, cohesive, not breaking apart easily, not scattering, holding itself together as it moves. And that imagined continuity creates a subtle mental effect, because your attention has to slow down in order to simulate it. Fast thinking does not easily hold on to slow-moving images. It tends to skip over them. But when you allow yourself to stay with that image, even briefly, your internal pacing adjusts to match it. And that adjustment does not feel forced. It feels natural, like your thinking is simply aligning with something already steady. At a deeper level, honey also represents accumulation without strain. Each drop begins as something small, almost insignificant on its own. But over time, those small contributions gather, they build, they consolidate until something substantial emerges. And there is no moment where effort feels overwhelming. Only continuity, only repetition, only gradual change. That idea alone can soften the mental tendency to expect everything to happen at once, because it shows another possibility: that meaningful outcomes are often the result of slow accumulation rather than sudden shifts. And when your mind reflects on that, even briefly, it often begins to loosen its grip on urgency, not by rejecting it, but by recognizing an alternative pace that already exists in nature. So honey becomes more than a subject of curiosity. It becomes a quiet demonstration of a different kind of timing, one that does not depend on acceleration, one that does not rely on pressure, one that simply unfolds. And as you stay with that unfolding, something gentle happens in the background of awareness. Thoughts may still appear, but they feel less demanding, less insistent, more spaced out, as if each one has more room to exist without immediately competing with the next. There is no need to force this change. It happens through familiarity, through sustained attention, through allowing a single idea to remain in focus long enough to influence the rhythm of thinking. And honey, in its quiet consistency, is more than capable of holding that focus. So as this idea continues to remain present, you may notice a gradual softening in how thoughts organize themselves. Less fragmentation, less urgency, more continuity. Not because anything has been removed, but because something steady has been introduced. A simple, natural pattern. Slow, stable, uninterrupted. And your mind, in its own way, knows how to follow that kind of pattern without needing to be told, just through quiet observation and the gentle influence of something that has never needed to rush at all. And as this quiet understanding continues to settle, something even more subtle begins to emerge beneath the surface of attention. It is the sense that honey is not just an object with properties, but a long, continuous process that never truly stops being relevant, even when it is stored, even when it is still, even when it is untouched for years. It remains the result of motion that has already completed itself in a very deliberate way, a history of movement condensed into stillness. And that contrast is where a deeper kind of calm begins to form in your thinking, because the mind is often preoccupied with movement that feels unfinished, thoughts that seem to demand continuation, ideas that feel like they are always in progress. But honey represents something different. It is movement that has already resolved into stability, and that resolution carries a quiet psychological effect. It reminds you that not all processes remain open-ended. Some naturally come to rest. There is also something important in how honey holds its identity over time. It does not lose itself easily. Even as it crystallizes, even as its texture changes, it remains fundamentally what it is. This is not rigidity, it is continuity, a consistent core preserved through gradual transformation. And when the mind observes that idea, it often begins to loosen its expectation that change must mean loss. Instead, it begins to recognize that change can also mean refinement, a slow distillation rather than a disruption. You might think of how honey is influenced by its environment, yet never fully controlled by it. The flowers change with seasons. The air shifts, temperatures rise and fall. And yet, the process inside the hive continues with a steady rhythm, not ignoring the environment, but integrating it, adapting without losing structure. And this is a quiet form of intelligence that exists in natural systems. Not resistance, not chaos, but integration, a balanced response to constant variation. When you think about that carefully, your attention may begin to soften again, because much of mental tension comes from resisting variation, from expecting stability in an unstable environment. But honey does not resist change. It processes it slowly, systematically, without urgency. And that kind of processing does not create friction. It creates continuity. Even the way honey spreads when it is placed on a surface reflects this principle. It does not break apart. It does not scatter. It expands in a controlled, cohesive way, always maintaining connection within itself, never losing its internal unity. And that behavior can quietly influence the way your thoughts feel when you hold onto a single idea for longer than usual. Instead of breaking into unrelated fragments, attention begins to maintain coherence, a kind of mental stickiness that keeps awareness gently anchored to one continuous thread. There is also a deeper observation that emerges when you consider how honey is never rushed by necessity. There is no point in its creation where speed becomes more important than precision. The bees do not accelerate the process beyond what the structure allows. They follow limits that are built into the system itself, and those limits are not restrictive in a negative sense. They are stabilizing. They ensure that the outcome remains consistent. And when the mind recognizes systems that operate within natural limits, it often becomes less preoccupied with forcing outcomes beyond their natural pace. There is a quiet acceptance that forms, not resignation, not withdrawal, but recognition that stability often depends on respecting pace rather than overriding it. This is where the idea of honey begins to feel less like information and more like a rhythm you can mentally align with, a rhythm that does not demand participation, only observation. And sustained observation in itself begins to change the quality of attention. You may notice that thoughts begin to space themselves out more evenly, not because anything is being pushed away, but because the mind is no longer accelerating to meet every passing idea with equal intensity. It begins to prioritize continuity over reaction, flow over interruption. And honey, in its physical behavior, reinforces that same pattern. It does not react quickly. It does not fragment under pressure. It responds slowly enough that change remains coherent. And coherence is one of the mind's most naturally calming experiences. Because when things are coherent, they are easier to hold in awareness. They require less mental correction, less adjustment, less effort to maintain understanding. Even the density of honey contributes to this effect. It does not behave like water. It resists sudden movement. It maintains form as it shifts. And that resistance to abrupt change creates a sense of predictability. Not predictability in the sense of repetition alone, but predictability in how it will behave when influenced. And the mind finds that deeply grounding. Because unpredictability requires constant recalibration, but predictability allows attention to relax, to observe without preparing for disruption, to remain present without scanning for instability. And in that kind of mental environment, thinking naturally slows, not through force, but through reduced need for defensive awareness. There is also something quietly profound in how honey exists as both process and product at the same time. It is the result of countless micro-actions, yet it appears unified, whole, simple, and that duality mirrors something in your own mental experience, because your thoughts are also made of many small shifts, many brief impressions, many subtle transitions, but they often appear as a single stream of awareness. When you recognize that, even lightly, it can soften the sense that everything must be controlled individually. Instead, you begin to see the larger flow that already holds those small movements together. Honey does not interrupt its own formation. It does not question each stage. It does not rush toward completion. It simply follows the conditions available to it until stability naturally emerges. And that is a quiet reminder that not all processes require supervision at every moment. Some can be allowed to unfold. As you continue to reflect on this, The mind may begin to feel slightly less segmented, less divided into competing directions, more unified in its attention, not perfectly still, but more continuous. And continuity, more than anything, is what often creates a sense of ease, because when awareness is continuous, it does not have to restart itself repeatedly. It does not have to reorient after each shift. It simply flows. Honey, in its slow and steady nature, offers a model of that flow, a physical representation of consistency without tension. And when your attention aligns with that model, even briefly, it begins to adopt similar qualities: less interruption, less urgency, more coherence. There is no need to deepen this further than it naturally goes. The idea does not require expansion to be effective. It only requires presence, a steady return to something simple and stable. Honey remains what it is: slow, unified, self-contained, and your awareness, in observing it, begins to reflect those same qualities in its own way, not by changing forcefully, but by gradually matching the rhythm it is exposed to, until thinking itself begins to feel less fragmented and more quietly continuous. And at this point, something more refined begins to appear in the way you relate to the idea itself. It stops being just about honey as a material substance and starts becoming about the principle of how slow systems sustain themselves without strain. Because when you look closely, honey is not maintained through effort in the way many human systems are. It does not require correction every moment. It does not depend on constant adjustment to remain functional. Instead, it relies on a structure that already accounts for stability within its own design. And that distinction is quietly important, because it separates two very different ways of existing: one that must constantly intervene to remain stable, and one that is stable because intervention is rarely necessary. In natural systems like honey production, stability is not something added later. It is built in from the beginning. The bees do not fix honey into being stable. They create conditions where instability is gradually reduced until it no longer dominates the system. And once that threshold is crossed, the substance holds itself together. This is not effortlessness in the sense of absence of work. It is effort distributed across time in such small increments that it never becomes overwhelming at any single moment. And that kind of distribution changes how pressure is experienced. When your mind observes a system like this, it begins to reconsider how intensity is structured internally, because much mental strain does not come from the presence of activity itself. It comes from activity being compressed into narrow windows of time. Too much happening at once. Too many adjustments required simultaneously. Honey does not behave that way. Its transformation is stretched across long durations, allowing each micro-change to remain proportionate to the system's capacity. Nothing exceeds its moment. And this introduces a quiet idea that stability is often a matter of pacing, not control. The more evenly something unfolds, the less it demands correction. And the less correction is needed, the more naturally the system maintains itself. This is visible in honey, but it also mirrors patterns in attention. When thoughts are allowed to unfold without being forced into immediate resolution, they tend to organize themselves more coherently, not because they are directed more aggressively, but because they are not being compressed. There is also a subtle property in honey that is easy to overlook. Its internal uniformity is not absolute sameness, but controlled variation. Floral sources differ, seasons differ, environmental conditions differ, yet what emerges remains recognizably consistent in behavior and structure. This kind of controlled variability is significant because it shows that stability does not require elimination of difference. It requires integration of difference into a coherent framework, and that is a more sophisticated form of balance. When the mind encounters that idea, it can begin to soften its tendency to treat variation as disruption. Not everything that changes is unstable. Not everything that shifts is breaking. Some systems simply absorb variation and reorganize around it without losing coherence. Honey does this silently, without effort or awareness. And in recognizing that, your attention begins to become less reactive to small internal changes. Thoughts arise, but they are not automatically treated as interruptions. They are treated as part of a continuous field. There is also a physical patience embedded in honey's structure that is worth considering. Even when conditions are optimal, the transformation of nectar into honey is not instantaneous. It requires repeated cycles of evaporation, enzymatic activity, and redistribution. Each cycle is small enough to be almost unnoticeable on its own, but collectively, they produce a stable outcome. And this reveals something important about gradual systems. They do not rely on dramatic transitions. They rely on accumulation that is almost invisible while it is happening. And that invisibility has a psychological effect, because the mind often associates progress with visible change. But honey challenges that assumption. It shows that significant transformation can occur without obvious markers at each stage. And when you extend that idea inward, it can shift how you interpret your own mental processes. Not everything meaningful needs to feel immediate or obvious while it is developing. Some forms of clarity emerge only after enough continuity has been established. There is also something to be noticed in how honey resists internal breakdown. Its structure is not fragile in the typical sense. It does not collapse under small environmental fluctuations. It maintains integrity through chemical and physical balance, and that integrity is not rigid. It is adaptive within limits. That combination, adaptability without loss of form, is one of the most stable configurations found in natural systems. When your attention rests on that concept, it begins to create a kind of internal reference point, a sense that stability does not require tension, that holding shape does not require resistance, that continuity can exist without rigidity, and from there, perception begins to adjust slightly. Thoughts still arise, but they feel less like competing demands and more like passing structures within a larger field of awareness. They do not need to be resolved immediately to be understood. They can exist briefly without requiring response. This is where the idea of honey becomes less about content and more about tempo, because tempo is what determines how experience is organized internally. Fast tempo fragments attention. Slow tempo allows continuity, and honey consistently exists within a slow tempo domain, not because it is inactive, but because its activity is distributed in a way that avoids disruption. Even the viscosity of honey contributes to this sense of continuity. Its resistance to flow is not obstruction, it is cohesion. It holds itself together as it moves, and that property subtly contrasts with mental patterns that tend to disperse quickly when not anchored. When attention aligns with something cohesive, it begins to mirror that cohesion, not by imitation in a literal sense, but by reduction of fragmentation. There is also a quiet stability in how honey does not seek change. Once it has reached its mature form, it does not continue transforming indefinitely. It reaches a state where further change becomes minimal unless external conditions shift significantly. And this introduces another idea, that completion does not always require termination, but stabilization, a point where change becomes rare enough that continuity dominates experience. When the mind reflects on that, even lightly, it can begin to reduce its tendency to interpret stillness as incompleteness. Stillness can be a state of resolution rather than absence, a state where nothing is missing, only settled. And as that perspective settles in, attention may feel slightly less pressured to move forward constantly, less compelled to fill every moment with transition, more willing to remain with a single thread of thought for longer periods without discomfort. Honey, in this sense, becomes a kind of model for non-urgent existence, not passive, not inactive, but unpressured. And that difference is subtle, yet meaningful, because pressure is often what transforms simple thought into mental noise. And when pressure is reduced, thought can remain simple without becoming fragmented. So as this idea continues to sit in awareness, it does not ask for interpretation or conclusion. It simply remains as an example of how stability can be built slowly, maintained quietly, and experienced without effort. And in following that example, even indirectly, the mind begins to adopt a slightly different rhythm, less interruption, less urgency, more continuity. Not as a deliberate change, but as a natural response to something that has always moved at its own steady pace. And as this reflection continues to deepen, something more subtle begins to unfold beneath the surface of the idea itself. It is no longer just about honey as a stable substance or a slow natural process. It becomes about how the mind interprets stability when it is presented without urgency, because stability, when observed quietly, does not feel static in the way people often assume. It feels continuous, alive in its own restrained way, always holding its structure without needing to announce it. Honey exists in that kind of quiet continuity. But what is more interesting is how that continuity is achieved without internal conflict. There is no struggle inside its formation that you can detect from the outside. No visible tension between states. No abrupt transitions that signal instability. Instead, there is a seamless progression of small, almost invisible adjustments, each one too minor to draw attention on its own, but collectively forming a consistent outcome. This is where a deeper idea begins to surface. That complexity does not always present itself through intensity. Sometimes it presents itself through restraint, through processes that are so evenly distributed across time that they appear simple, even when they are not. And when the mind engages with that kind of structure, something important happens in how attention organizes itself. It begins to value continuity over stimulation, not because stimulation is absent, but because it is no longer necessary for engagement. The mind can remain present without requiring constant novelty. Honey does not change rapidly enough to force attention into reaction. Instead, it invites observation at a steady pace, and that steady pace allows perception to remain in one place long enough for patterns to become visible, patterns that would otherwise be missed in faster thinking. There is also something significant in the way honey embodies preservation without isolation. It does not become stable by disconnecting from its environment. It becomes stable by integrating elements from that environment into a structure that can hold them over time. This is a form of resilience that does not rely on separation. It relies on coherence. When the mind considers this, even in a quiet background way, it can begin to reinterpret its own fluctuations, not as disruptions that must be corrected immediately, but as variations that can be integrated. Not every shift in thought needs to be resolved. Some can simply be held within a broader continuity of awareness, and that broader continuity becomes more noticeable the longer attention remains with a single, stable idea. Like honey, which does not require frequent redefinition of itself, the mind does not need constant reorganization when it is not being pulled in multiple directions at once. It can remain intact while still allowing movement within it. There is also a quiet lesson in how honey interacts with containment. When placed in a jar, it conforms to the space without losing its internal unity. It does not fracture to fit boundaries. It adapts while maintaining cohesion, and that behavior reflects a kind of intelligence embedded in physical structure rather than conscious intention. This form of adaptation is not reactive. It is pre-aligned with constraint, which means that boundaries do not create conflict within it. They simply define the shape of expression. And when the mind reflects on that, even briefly, it begins to loosen its assumption that limits are inherently restrictive. Limits can also be stabilizing. They can define space in a way that reduces internal dispersion. They can provide structure without reducing depth. Honey demonstrates this without explanation. It simply exists within its constraints without tension. And that absence of tension becomes noticeable when contrasted with processes that resist containment. There is also a temporal aspect that becomes more apparent here. Honey does not operate on sudden shifts in state. It transitions slowly enough that each phase blends into the next without abrupt distinction. This creates a kind of temporal continuity that is rare in more volatile systems. Nothing feels isolated in time. Each moment connects to the next without interruption. And when attention aligns with that continuity, perception begins to reflect it. Thoughts feel less segmented, less like discrete events, more like a continuous flow with subtle variations rather than sharp breaks. This does not require effort to maintain. It arises naturally when attention is not repeatedly reset or redirected. And honey, as a subject of focus, supports that condition simply through its own structural behavior. There is also a deeper sense in which honey represents accumulated patience, not patience as waiting in anticipation, but patience as embedded time that has already been integrated into form. Each drop contains the result of countless small actions performed without urgency, and those actions no longer appear as individual efforts. They appear as a unified result. This is an important shift in perception because it shows that effort does not always remain visible in its final outcome. Sometimes effort dissolves into structure so completely that only stability remains perceptible. And when the mind recognizes that, it begins to reconsider how it interprets its own gradual processes. Not everything that is forming needs to feel like it is forming. Some things only become visible once they are complete enough to be coherent. There is also a quiet effect in how honey resists internal separation. Even when it is disturbed, it tends to return to a unified state, not instantly, but consistently. It does not remain scattered for long, and that tendency toward recoherence is part of what makes it feel stable even when in motion. When attention observes that behavior, it can begin to adopt a similar tendency internally. Thoughts may still diverge briefly, but they do not remain disconnected. They return. They settle back into a shared field of awareness. This is not something that needs to be controlled. It is something that becomes more likely when attention is no longer fragmented by rapid switching. The longer focus remains steady, the more naturally coherence reestablishes itself. Honey, in its own way, demonstrates what it means to maintain identity through gradual change. It does not become something entirely different as it matures. It refines what it already is. And that refinement does not introduce instability. It reinforces structure. So when you consider honey not as a single object, but as an ongoing demonstration of slow integration, it begins to represent a broader principle. That stability is not the absence of change. It is change that does not disrupt continuity. And that principle, once noticed, can subtly shift how attention relates to its own movement. Instead of seeking to eliminate change, it begins to allow change to exist within a stable frame. Instead of reacting to every variation, it begins to hold variations within a wider field of continuity. In that sense, honey is not just something to think about. It becomes a quiet reference for how systems can remain coherent while still evolving. A demonstration that slowness is not emptiness. It is structured presence over time. And as this idea remains present in awareness, it does not push the mind toward conclusion. It simply continues to offer a steady example of how coherence can exist without urgency. And in that steady example, attention itself begins to feel less divided and more quietly continuous in its own way. And if you continue following this line of thought, the focus begins to shift again, this time away from structure and process and toward perception itself. Because honey is not only something that exists in nature, it is also something your nervous system interprets in a very specific way. And that interpretation is quiet, almost understated, but deeply consistent. When you think about honey, your brain does not treat it as a threat or as a demand for action. It classifies it differently, as safe energy, as familiar nourishment, as something already understood. This classification matters more than it seems, because the brain is constantly evaluating the environment in terms of prediction. It asks, without language, a simple question: is this stable, or does it require immediate adjustment? And honey, across nearly all human experience, tends to fall into the category of low threat, low unpredictability, low urgency, not because it is emotionally comforting in a dramatic sense, but because it is biologically consistent. Sweetness in nature often signals energy availability, and over long evolutionary time, that signal became associated with reliability rather than danger. So when your mind encounters the idea of honey, even abstractly, it is not just processing an object, it is processing a category of predictability, a signal that does not require defensive attention. And in neural terms, that means something subtle happens in the background. The brain reduces the need for constant updating. It lowers the intensity of prediction correction. It does not have to constantly revise expectations in response to the stimulus. Because honey, conceptually, does not violate expectation. It remains within a stable range of meaning. This reduction in prediction load creates a quieter mental environment. Not silent, just less reactive. There is also another layer beneath this. Honey engages what can be called embodied familiarity. Even without tasting it, your mind can simulate its texture, its density, its slow movement. This simulation is not abstract. It recruits sensory memory systems: touch, taste, even visual weight. And these systems operate more slowly than analytical thought. They are grounded in experience rather than interpretation. So when you imagine honey, your cognition shifts into a slightly different mode, less linguistic, more sensory, less segmented, more continuous. And that shift is important, because sensory-based cognition tends to reduce mental fragmentation. It does not divide experience into as many discrete conceptual parts. It holds it as a single blended impression. This is one of the reasons certain natural substances feel mentally calming to consider, not because they are emotional symbols, but because they engage slower processing systems in the brain, systems that do not rely heavily on rapid categorization or decision-making. There is also a concept in neuroscience that aligns quietly with this experience. The brain is constantly minimizing surprise. It prefers inputs that match internal models. When something behaves in a consistent, non-threatening way, the brain expends less energy interpreting it. Honey fits this pattern almost perfectly. It is predictable in behavior, stable in structure, and familiar in meaning across contexts. So, in a very indirect way, thinking about honey reduces cognitive error correction. And when error correction decreases, mental activity often becomes less dense, less urgent, less layered with competing interpretations. This is not relaxation in an emotional sense. It is a reduction in processing demand, and that reduction allows attention to become more spacious without effort. Thoughts are still present, but they are not competing as aggressively for resolution. There is also a quieter biological dimension to honey that often goes unnoticed in purely structural descriptions. Honey is chemically resistant to decay. Its environment is hostile to microbial growth due to its low water activity and natural composition. This means it maintains integrity not through external preservation, but through internal conditions that discourage breakdown. From a systems perspective, this is significant. It represents a form of self-stabilizing chemistry, a state where the internal configuration reduces entropy increase over time. And entropy, in simple terms, is the tendency for systems to become more disordered unless energy is applied to maintain structure. Most things drift toward disorder. Honey resists that drift, not by stopping time, but by limiting the pathways through which disorder can easily spread. When you think about that carefully, it introduces a quiet contrast to how mental experience often feels. Thoughts tend to disperse unless held with attention. They fragment easily when not anchored. But honey represents a system where dispersion is naturally constrained, and simply holding that contrast in awareness can subtly influence how attention organizes itself. It becomes easier to recognize when thinking is dispersing unnecessarily, and easier to allow it to remain unified when no action is required. There is also an interesting cultural layer to honey that reinforces its psychological neutrality. Across many civilizations, honey has been associated with preservation, medicine, and ritual, not because of intensity, but because of reliability. It is one of the few natural substances that has maintained symbolic continuity across time without needing reinterpretation. This consistency across cultures mirrors its physical consistency, and your mind often treats culturally stable symbols as cognitively low-load concepts. They do not require redefinition. They are already integrated into understanding. So when honey appears in thought, it carries that same sense of established meaning. No need to decode it, no need to analyze it deeply in order to categorize it. It is already settled in its identity, and that already settled quality is what makes it cognitively quiet. There is also a subtle rhythm to how honey exists in contrast to urgency. It does not accelerate when pressure is applied. It responds, but it does not rush. Its movement remains within its own internal constraints, and that constraint-based behavior is very different from reactive behavior. It does not escalate. It does not fragment. It remains cohesive even under influence. And when attention observes that kind of non-reactive system, it begins to reduce its own tendency toward internal escalation, not consciously, but through repetition of exposure to a stable model. Another way to understand this is through information density. Honey carries a relatively low informational volatility. It does not change meaning depending on context. It remains what it is, and low volatility stimuli tend to produce less cognitive scanning. The mind does not search for hidden shifts or sudden contradictions, so attention becomes less investigative, more observational, less alert, more continuous. And that continuity is what allows thought to feel less segmented. At a deeper level, Honey can be understood as a system that compresses time into a stable form, not by speeding up processes, but by allowing them to settle completely into structure. What once unfolded over time becomes stored as a coherent state, a kind of slow history made physically stable. And when the mind reflects on that, it is indirectly engaging with the idea that processes do not always need to remain in progress. In perception, some things can be mentally completed simply by understanding their continuity. There is no urgency in that recognition, only a gradual softening of the need to keep everything mentally active. And as that softening continues, attention begins to rest in a slightly different configuration, less divided across multiple interpretations, less pressured to maintain constant analysis, more willing to remain with a single, steady idea for longer without disruption. Honey, in this sense, becomes less about sweetness or biology or structure, and more about how stability feels when it does not require maintenance. A quiet example of continuity that does not depend on effort to sustain itself. And as that example remains present in awareness, thinking itself begins to feel a little less fragmented at the edges and a little more unified in its ongoing flow, without needing anything further to complete it. And as this exploration continues, something even more subtle comes into focus. Something that is not about honey as a substance anymore, but about how the mind behaves when it stays with one stable reference long enough to notice its own structure. Because at a certain point, the idea of honey stops adding new information. Instead, it starts changing the pace at which information is processed, and that shift is quiet, but meaningful. It is not about learning more. It is about thinking less reactively while still remaining fully aware. This is where attention begins to reveal its own background behavior. Normally, the mind moves in quick layers: interpretation, association, anticipation, reaction. But when it is anchored to something consistent and low demand, like the concept of honey in its slow, stable logic, those layers do not stack as aggressively. They begin to separate slightly, not in a fragmented way, but in a more spacious arrangement. You may notice that thoughts still appear, but they do not immediately demand follow-up. They arrive, stay briefly, then fade without pulling the entire stream of attention with them. This is not suppression, it is reduced momentum, and that reduction of momentum is where a different kind of clarity begins to form. Not sharp clarity, not analytical precision, but a softer clarity that comes from fewer interruptions inside the thinking process. At this level of observation, honey becomes less of a subject and more of a reference rhythm, a mental pattern that the brain can quietly align with without effort. And alignment here does not mean imitation. It means the nervous system no longer has to constantly adjust its pacing. There is also something important in how repetition behaves in natural systems like honey production. Repetition is not redundancy. It is reinforcement of stability. Each small action does not aim to be unique. It aims to be consistent enough that the system remains coherent over time. And coherence, in cognitive terms, is one of the least demanding states the mind can occupy, because coherence reduces the need for correction. When thoughts are coherent, they do not compete as intensely for interpretation. They do not require constant sorting. Instead, they form a continuous field where meaning is already partially organized before conscious effort intervenes. This is why sustained attention to a single stable idea can feel mentally spacious rather than mentally crowded, not because content is being removed, but because internal conflict is reduced. There is also a quieter biological parallel worth noticing. The brain does not experience all inputs equally. Some inputs require rapid evaluation. Others are classified as safe, predictable, or non-threatening, and are processed with minimal resource allocation. Honey, conceptually, falls into that second category. It does not trigger urgency pathways. It does not require defensive recalibration. It is metabolically and cognitively light to hold in awareness. And when something is cognitively light, attention does not brace against it. It does not prepare for change. It simply continues alongside it. That alongside quality is important because it shifts the relationship between observer and idea. Instead of attention chasing meaning, It remains adjacent to it, present without pursuit. This reduces internal friction in a very specific way. Friction in thinking often comes from rapid switching between interpretations, from trying to resolve meaning faster than it naturally unfolds. But when the reference point is stable, switching decreases, and when switching decreases, continuity increases. Honey, in this sense, functions less like a topic and more like a stabilizing frame for attention, a frame that does not demand engagement, but supports sustained presence. There is also an interesting aspect in how honey behaves when viewed over time rather than moment to moment. Its properties do not change abruptly. They remain consistent across observation. This consistency gives the mind fewer reasons to re-evaluate it repeatedly, and repeated re-evaluation is one of the hidden sources of mental fatigue in everyday cognition. The brain is constantly checking, has something changed? Is this still the same? Do I need to update my understanding? But when change is minimal, those checks gradually quiet down, and in that quieting, a different awareness becomes more noticeable, one that is not constantly scanning for updates, but simply resting in continuity. At this stage, honey is no longer being analyzed in the traditional sense. It is being held as a steady cognitive environment. And environments like this influence thought more through tone than through content. Tone here refers to the internal pacing of awareness, not emotional tone, but structural tone, the rhythm at which cognition unfolds. When that rhythm slows, thoughts begin to feel less compressed. They occupy more space in awareness without overlapping aggressively. And that spacing is what allows mental clarity to feel effortless rather than constructed. There is also a deeper shift that can happen when attention remains with a stable idea long enough. The distinction between thinking about something and simply staying with something begins to soften. Thinking becomes less directional, more observational. Instead of moving toward conclusions, attention begins to hover within the structure of the idea itself, not trying to extract anything new, not trying to resolve anything unfinished, just maintaining presence within a consistent field. And in that state, even subtle mental noise becomes less dominant, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer amplified by rapid transitions. Honey, as a reference, supports this by offering a mental model where nothing demands acceleration. Its entire existence is built on gradual integration rather than sudden change, and that graduality becomes psychologically contagious in a very quiet way. The mind begins to mirror the absence of urgency. There is also something notable about how honey preserves complexity without displaying it. On the surface, it appears simple, but beneath that simplicity is a layered system of enzymatic transformation, environmental interaction, and structural stability. Yet none of that complexity appears chaotic. It is fully integrated, and when the mind encounters complexity that is already integrated, it does not feel the need to deconstruct it aggressively. It can accept it as a unified whole. That acceptance reduces cognitive tension, because much mental tension comes from unresolved segmentation, parts of understanding that have not yet been integrated into a coherent picture. But honey does not present itself as segmented. It presents itself as already unified, and that unity changes how it is held in awareness. It requires less mental effort to maintain, less active structuring, less interpretive load. Over time, this creates a slightly different quality of attention, less reactive, less divided, more continuous in its unfolding. Not because anything external has changed in intensity, but because the internal demand for constant reprocessing has decreased, and as that demand decreases, attention naturally becomes more stable on its own, not frozen, not rigid, just less interrupted. So the idea of honey gradually transforms again. It is no longer just a subject of observation. It becomes a quiet demonstration of how systems behave when they are allowed to settle fully into their own structure without interference. And in following that demonstration, even passively, the mind begins to reflect a similar quality, not through imitation, but through reduced internal disruption. Thoughts continue, but they no longer compete as intensely for dominance. They move through awareness with less resistance, less urgency, more continuity. And in that continuity, the experience of thinking itself becomes slightly more unified, as if everything is occurring within a single, steady rhythm that does not need to be adjusted to remain intact. And as this steady rhythm continues to hold in awareness, something even quieter begins to surface beneath it. Something that is not about honey anymore, and not even about attention in the usual sense, but about how perception stabilizes when it is no longer being pulled toward constant reinterpretation. Because at some point, the mind stops treating every idea as something that must be processed for novelty. It begins to allow certain ideas to simply remain present without further extraction, not because they are ignored, but because they are already complete in their immediate form. Honey, as a concept, naturally supports this shift. It does not invite analysis that leads to contradiction. It does not contain unstable edges that force redefinition. Instead, it offers a closed system of understanding that remains consistent, no matter how long it is observed. And when the mind stays with something consistent for long enough, a subtle recalibration occurs in how attention allocates itself. You may notice that awareness becomes less segmented into what is happening now and what should be processed next. That constant internal scheduling begins to soften, not abruptly, not as a noticeable event, but as a gradual reduction in internal switching. And internal switching is one of the hidden sources of mental load. Every shift between thoughts requires a small reorientation, a re-establishment of context, a reloading of interpretive frames. When those shifts become less frequent, even slightly, the mind begins to feel less occupied without anything being removed from it. This is where the idea of honey begins to act like a stabilizing background condition rather than a focal object. It is not something the mind moves through. It is something the mind rests within. And resting within a stable cognitive field changes the texture of thought itself. Ideas no longer feel like isolated units competing for attention. They begin to feel like variations within a single continuous environment. In that environment, the pressure to reach conclusions decreases, because conclusions are often driven by urgency, by the need to resolve uncertainty quickly. But honey does not present uncertainty in an active form. It presents continuity, and continuity reduces the demand for immediate resolution. There is also a subtle effect that emerges when attention is not repeatedly redirected. Memory begins to feel less fragmented, not in the sense of recalling more information, but in the sense that experiences feel less divided into disconnected segments. They begin to feel part of a continuous stream that does not require constant reassembly. This continuity has a stabilizing influence on cognition, because fragmentation often creates the feeling that thought is scattered. But when perception remains anchored to a single consistent reference, even abstractly, that scattering reduces. Honey provides that anchor not through force, but through predictability. Its behavior does not introduce surprises that require recalibration. It remains within a stable range of expectation, and that stability allows the mind to relax its monitoring function. There is also a deeper structural similarity worth noticing between honey and sustained attention itself. Both rely on coherence maintained over time rather than intensity at any single moment. Neither is defined by spikes of activity. Both are defined by consistency across duration, and duration is where perception begins to change most noticeably. Short attention produces sharp segmentation. Extended attention produces blending. Edges soften, transitions become less pronounced, and meaning begins to feel more continuous rather than constructed in discrete steps. In this state, honey is no longer something being understood. It is something being held in awareness long enough for its qualities to influence the rhythm of thought indirectly. And that influence is subtle. It does not impose structure. It allows structure to emerge more naturally by reducing interruption. There is also an important distinction here between complexity and intensity. Honey is chemically complex, yet perceptually simple. That contrast matters, because the mind does not register complexity in proportion to how intricate something is, but in proportion to how much cognitive effort is required to maintain it in awareness. Since honey requires little effort to maintain as a coherent concept, it feels simple to hold. And when something feels simple to hold, attention does not fragment around it. This is why certain natural systems feel calming even when they are objectively intricate. They do not demand constant interpretive adjustment. They stabilize rather than destabilize perception. And as this stabilization continues, attention begins to settle into a more uniform distribution. Instead of concentrating heavily on shifting focal points, it spreads more evenly across the present field of awareness, not diffuse in a distracted sense, but evenly sustained. This evenness reduces the sensation of mental pressure, because pressure often arises when attention is forced into narrow channels repeatedly. But when attention is distributed more smoothly, internal resistance decreases. Honey conceptually supports that distribution by offering a single, stable reference that does not require narrowing focus to understand. It allows attention to remain broad while still coherent. There is also a quieter observation about time embedded in this experience. When attention is anchored to something stable, subjective time often feels less segmented. Moments are not constantly being marked by internal transitions. They blend more naturally into each other. This does not change time itself. It changes how time is passed internally. Less division creates the impression of continuity, and continuity is what allows mental space to feel less crowded. Because crowdedness is not only about how many thoughts exist, but how frequently they interrupt each other. When interruption decreases, even slightly, mental space feels larger without anything external changing. At this point, honey functions almost like a reference for non-interruptive cognition, a model where processes do not compete for dominance, but coexist within a stable framework. And that model begins to influence how attention behaves in subtle ways, not by instruction, but by exposure. The mind tends to align itself with whatever it holds consistently. So when it holds something slow, stable, and non-reactive, it gradually adopts a similar internal pacing. There is no need for deliberate control in this shift. It happens through reduction of cognitive friction, and as friction decreases, thought becomes less segmented by default. It does not need to be actively organized as often. It organizes itself more smoothly. Honey, in this sense, becomes less about what it is and more about how it behaves in the field of attention. A steady, non-disruptive presence that does not demand escalation. And that lack of demand is what makes it quietly influential. Because attention does not resist what does not pressure it. It simply adjusts. So as this adjustment continues, thinking begins to feel less like a series of separate acts and more like a single unfolding process that does not require constant reinitiation. Not faster, not slower, just less interrupted and more continuously held within a stable frame that does not need to be maintained consciously in order to remain intact. And as that sense of continuity becomes more established, something even more refined begins to appear beneath the surface of attention, not as a new idea, but as a change in how ideas relate to each other while they are being held. Because when interruption decreases, the mind does not simply think more slowly. It begins to reorganize the spacing between thoughts, not by altering their content, but by adjusting the intervals in which they appear and dissolve. In ordinary conditions, thoughts often behave like discrete events. One emerges, claims attention, fades, and is replaced by another. This creates a subtle sense of segmentation, even when nothing feels particularly stressful. But when attention is anchored to something structurally stable, something like the concept of honey in its consistent, low volatility form, those segments begin to soften at the edges. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer feel sharply separated. They begin to overlap slightly in awareness, not as confusion, but as continuity. One impression does not fully end before another begins to form, and this overlap reduces the sensation of abrupt mental switching. That reduction is important because switching is one of the most energetically expensive operations in cognition. Each switch requires reorientation, context rebuilding, and a brief recalibration of focus. When switching becomes less frequent, even subtly, the mind experiences a decrease in internal effort without any loss of clarity. Honey, as a conceptual anchor, supports this by remaining unchanged in its internal definition. It does not require reclassification. It does not introduce contradiction. It does not shift meaning depending on how long it is considered. And that consistency removes one of the main triggers for mental re-evaluation. There is also a deeper structural quality worth noticing here. Honey does not present itself as a problem to be solved. It does not contain unresolved tension that demands cognitive closure. It is already resolved in its form. And when attention engages with something resolved, it stops searching for missing pieces. That cessation of searching is subtle, but significant, because a large portion of mental activity is not active thinking, It is scanning for incompleteness, for gaps, for inconsistencies, for changes that require adjustment. When those signals are not present, scanning reduces. And when scanning reduces, attention becomes less divided between observation and correction. At this stage, honey functions less like an object of focus and more like a stabilizing environment within awareness, something that does not require engagement, but supports coherence simply by remaining consistent. And coherence, in cognitive terms, is not about having fewer thoughts. It is about having thoughts that do not compete for structural dominance within awareness. They can coexist without destabilizing each other. There is also an interesting shift that occurs in how time is internally experienced when coherence increases. Time does not feel faster or slower in an objective sense. It feels less segmented. Fewer internal interruptions mean fewer markers of transition, and fewer markers of transition reduce the perception of fragmentation in experience. Honey contributes to this indirectly by providing a reference that does not itself mark transitions. It does not change in a way that forces awareness to reset its frame of observation. It remains within a consistent behavioral range, and that consistency reduces the need for temporal recalibration. Another subtle layer emerges when considering how honey embodies integration rather than separation. Its properties are not isolated functions. They are interdependent. Density, viscosity, stability, resistance to decay, all of these characteristics reinforce each other rather than operating independently. This interdependence creates a unified system where no single property stands alone. And when the mind encounters systems like this, it tends to mirror their structure in its own organization of attention. Instead of isolating each thought as a separate unit requiring independent processing, awareness begins to treat thoughts as part of a continuous relational field. Meaning arises from connection rather than separation. This shift reduces cognitive load in a very quiet way, because maintaining isolated structures requires constant boundary management, but maintaining relational continuity requires far less active correction. Honey, in its natural state, does not require boundary enforcement to remain stable. Its stability emerges from internal composition rather than external control, and that distinction becomes more noticeable the longer attention remains with it. There is also a refinement in how predictability begins to feel. Predictability is often misunderstood as repetition, but in this context, it is more accurately described as non-surprising continuity. Honey does not behave in ways that force reinterpretation. It behaves within a stable envelope of expectation, and when expectation is consistently met, the mind reduces its predictive tension. It does not need to constantly simulate alternative outcomes. It does not need to prepare for divergence. It can remain within a narrower range of anticipatory processing. That reduction in anticipatory activity is one of the reasons sustained focus on stable concepts feels mentally quiet, not because thought disappears, but because forward modeling slows down. There is also something important in how honey exists as a completed transformation, rather than an ongoing, unstable one. It represents a process that has reached equilibrium, not a temporary pause, but a stable endpoint of gradual change. And when the mind encounters representations of equilibrium, it begins to reduce its own tendency to accelerate interpretation, because there is no pressure to complete unfinished motion. Nothing in the concept suggests incompletion. At this point, attention begins to shift from processing meaning to maintaining presence, and maintaining presence requires far less internal adjustment than interpreting novelty. There is also a subtle perceptual change that can occur when attention remains with a stable reference for extended periods. Background noise in cognition, small, unrelated thoughts, begins to lose prominence, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer reinforced by frequent attentional switching. Without switching, secondary thoughts do not gain momentum. They arise and fade without building internal complexity. Honey, as a conceptual anchor, supports this by remaining non-reactive. It does not amplify associative chains that lead away from its core properties. It remains centered within a narrow behavioral range of meaning, and that centering effect naturally reduces associative dispersion. At a deeper level, what is happening is a gradual synchronization between the pacing of attention and the pacing of the concept being observed. Honey operates slowly, consistently, without abrupt change. Attention, when not forced into faster cycles, begins to align with that rhythm. This alignment does not require effort. It occurs through reduction of contrast. When two rhythms are mismatched, tension is created. When they become closer, tension decreases, and decreased tension allows awareness to feel less divided between multiple internal demands. There is also a final, subtle observation here. Honey does not require interpretation to maintain its coherence. It simply remains coherent, and that quality, non-dependence on interpretation for stability, is what makes it uniquely suitable as a mental reference for continuity. Because the mind, when not required to constantly interpret, begins to experience itself as more unified, not through simplification, but through reduced interruption of its own flow. And in that reduced interruption, thinking does not become empty. It becomes continuous, less segmented, less reactive, more steadily present within its own unfolding, without needing to re-establish itself at every moment. And as this continuity becomes more familiar, something even more subtle begins to shift in the background of awareness. It is not that thoughts disappear or become fewer. It is that the relationship between thoughts changes. They no longer feel like isolated units competing for attention. They begin to feel like gradual variations within a single unfolding field. And that field does not need to be rebuilt each time something new appears within it. Honey, as a reference point, supports this shift in a very quiet way, not by introducing new content, but by maintaining a stable conceptual boundary that does not demand reinterpretation. It remains internally consistent regardless of how long it is considered, and that consistency reduces the mental impulse to reevaluate it repeatedly. When the mind no longer feels compelled to recheck the stability of its focus, attention begins to free up small amounts of cognitive space, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that becomes noticeable only through contrast. There is less internal re-entry into the same idea from different angles, fewer loops of reassessment. Instead, awareness begins to rest in a more continuous mode of engagement, not fixed, not rigid, just less interrupted by internal reprocessing. This change affects how depth is experienced. Depth is no longer created by analysis alone. It begins to emerge from sustained presence with a stable reference. The longer attention remains with something coherent, the more layers reveal themselves naturally without force. Honey, in this sense, does not deepen through complexity. It deepens through duration, through remaining the same long enough for perception to move through it at different speeds without losing cohesion. There is also a quiet shift in how mental edges behave. Normally, thoughts have sharp beginnings and endings. They enter awareness, peak in clarity, and then fade out before being replaced. But when interruption decreases, those edges soften. A thought can begin while another is still dissolving. And instead of collision, there is blending. This blending reduces the sense of discrete mental events. Experience begins to feel more continuous, less punctuated, not because structure is lost, but because segmentation becomes less pronounced. Honey naturally reflects this kind of continuity. Its state does not reset. It transitions internally, without external markers of change. Even when crystallization occurs, the identity of the substance remains continuous. There is no sudden break between forms, only gradual reconfiguration. And when the mind observes processes that do not rely on abrupt transitions, it begins to reduce its own tendency to create artificial segmentation in thought. It becomes less dependent on internal starting points and ending points to organize experience. Instead, it begins to perceive continuity as the default condition. There is also a subtle reduction in what could be called cognitive resistance. This is not resistance in an emotional sense, but the slight friction that occurs when the mind tries to hold multiple interpretations in parallel and keep them separate. In a fragmented state, each thought requires a kind of containment to prevent overlap. But in a more continuous state, containment is less necessary because overlap is no longer perceived as interference. Honey, conceptually, supports this by being inherently unified. Its properties are not competing forces. They are integrated expressions of the same underlying structure. Density, stability, cohesion. They do not conflict internally. And when attention aligns with something that does not contain internal contradiction, It does not need to spend energy resolving inconsistency. That energy becomes available for sustained observation instead. There is also a quiet shift in how anticipation behaves. Normally, the mind projects forward constantly, simulating what comes next in order to prepare for it. This projection is rapid and often unconscious, but when attention is anchored in something stable and non-surprising, forward projection reduces slightly, not because the future is absent, but because it becomes less urgent to model it continuously. Honey does not require anticipation to be understood. It does not change in ways that demand predictive adjustment, so the mind relaxes its forecasting activity when holding it in awareness. This reduction in anticipatory processing contributes to a sense of mental stillness that is not static, but evenly distributed. Thoughts still occur, but they are less driven by forward pressure. There is also an important distinction emerging here between engagement and effort. Engagement remains present. Attention is still active, but effort decreases because fewer corrective processes are required to maintain coherence. Honey does not demand effort to remain understandable. It remains accessible without reinterpretation, and that accessibility reduces cognitive strain in a way that is easy to overlook unless contrasted with more volatile stimuli. Another subtle aspect becomes noticeable when attention remains with a single stable idea for extended periods. The boundary between observer and observed becomes less emphasized, not dissolved, but less highlighted. The mind is no longer constantly stepping back to re-establish separation between itself and the object of focus. Instead, awareness feels more like a shared field in which both thought and observation coexist without sharp division. This does not alter identity, it alters emphasis. The distinction is still present, but it is no longer constantly reinforced. Honey contributes to this by not requiring interpretive distance. It does not challenge perception in a way that forces re-evaluation of perspective. It remains stable regardless of how it is approached, and stability of that kind reduces the need for constant cognitive repositioning. There is also a gradual change in how mental sequencing behaves. In more fragmented states, thoughts often feel like a chain of separate links. One leads to another through association or reaction. But in a more continuous state, sequencing becomes less linear and more layered. Multiple impressions can coexist within a single moment without requiring strict ordering. This reduces the sensation of mental urgency that comes from needing to keep up with thought progression. Instead of following a rapid chain, attention begins to hold a broader segment of experience at once. Honey, as a reference, supports this by being non-linear in its informational demand. It does not require step-by-step processing to remain coherent. Its meaning is accessible as a whole rather than as a sequence. And when something can be understood holistically, the mind does not need to break it into smaller analytical units as frequently. There is also a quieter effect in how emotional tone interacts with stable concepts. In this context, emotional intensity is not heightened or suppressed. It simply becomes less reactive because there are fewer triggers for rapid interpretive shifts. Honey does not introduce sudden contrast. It remains within a narrow experiential band, and narrow variability reduces the likelihood of emotional fluctuation tied to cognitive surprise. This leads to a more neutral baseline of awareness, not flat, not empty, but evenly distributed across perception. At this stage, the idea of honey is no longer functioning as a topic being explored. It functions more like a stabilizing continuity that awareness can rest against while still remaining fully alert. And that rest is not inactivity. It is reduced fragmentation within activity itself. Thoughts continue to arise, but they do not interrupt each other as sharply. They do not compete for dominance in the same way. They pass through awareness with less resistance, and in that reduced resistance, cognition becomes less segmented and more unified in its unfolding, not simplified, not diminished, just less interrupted in its natural flow. And as this quieter continuity deepens, something even more refined begins to emerge in how awareness organizes experience itself. It is no longer about honey as a concept holding attention. It becomes about how attention behaves when it is no longer forced to reset itself repeatedly. Because one of the most unnoticed aspects of thinking is not the content of thought, but the constant re-establishment of focus after each shift. That re-establishment is usually silent, automatic, and invisible. Yet it is always happening in the background. When attention rests on something stable, that constant resetting begins to reduce, not all at once, not in a noticeable break, but in a gradual easing of internal effort required to remain present. And in that easing, awareness begins to feel less segmented by transitions. Instead of repeatedly returning to a starting point after each idea, it begins to remain within a continuous frame of observation, a frame that does not need to be rebuilt each time something new appears within it. Honey, as a reference structure, supports this condition by offering a form of conceptual stability that does not introduce contradiction or urgency. It does not shift its internal meaning depending on duration of observation. It does not require reinterpretation to remain coherent, and because of that, it reduces the cognitive demand for reframing. This reduction is subtle but important, because reframing is one of the hidden processes that contributes to mental fatigue. Each time attention shifts, a small reconstruction occurs. Context is reassembled, relevance is recalculated, and internal orientation is adjusted. When those adjustments become less frequent, even slightly, the overall experience of thinking becomes less fragmented. At this point, awareness begins to operate less like a sequence of discrete evaluations and more like a continuous field with internal variation, not uniform, not static, but continuously connected. There is also a quiet shift in how meaning forms under these conditions. In more segmented thinking, meaning often appears after interpretation is completed. First, the thought arrives, then it is processed, then meaning is assigned. But in a continuous mode of attention, meaning begins to appear earlier in the process, not as conclusion, but as immediate coherence. Honey reflects this in its own structure. It does not require deconstruction to be understood at a functional level. Its properties are already integrated into a unified whole, so meaning is not something extracted step by step. It is something immediately accessible through sustained presence. And sustained presence changes the tempo of cognition, not by slowing it artificially, but by removing interruptions that force rapid reorientation. There is also a noticeable reduction in what might be called interpretive tension. This tension arises when the mind is actively trying to resolve uncertainty between competing interpretations of the same experience. In fragmented cognition, multiple possible meanings are held briefly in competition before one is selected. That competition consumes attention resources, but when attention is anchored to something stable and non-contradictory, the need for competition decreases. Fewer interpretations are generated because fewer ambiguities are introduced. Honey does not generate ambiguity through behavior. It remains within a predictable structural range. And predictability, in this context, is not about repetition of outcome, but about absence of interpretive conflict. There is also a deeper structural implication in how honey exists as a completed transformation rather than an ongoing, unstable process. It represents a state where change has already settled into equilibrium, not frozen, but stabilized through internal consistency. And when the mind engages with representations of equilibrium, it begins to reduce its tendency to over-process transitions, because there is no implied instability requiring correction. Nothing in the concept signals urgency. This creates a mental environment where attention does not feel compelled to constantly update its position relative to the idea. Instead, it remains within a steady orientation toward it. At this stage, thinking begins to feel less like movement between points and more like variation within a single extended field. Ideas still appear, but they do not disrupt the continuity of awareness in the same way. They integrate more easily into the ongoing structure of thought. Honey, as a conceptual anchor, contributes to this by not introducing directional demand. It does not require attention to move toward a specific conclusion. It allows attention to remain within observation without pressure to resolve. And that absence of directional pressure is what reduces cognitive acceleration. When there is no need to reach a specific endpoint, thinking naturally becomes less linear. There is also a subtle change in how memory participates in awareness under these conditions. Instead of retrieving isolated fragments, memory begins to feel more associative and continuous. Experiences are not recalled as separate units, but as part of a broader contextual flow. This reduces the sensation of mental discontinuity between past and present impressions, and that continuity contributes to a quieter internal environment. Honey supports this indirectly by providing a stable reference that does not trigger frequent associative branching. It does not lead attention into rapid expansion of related concepts. It remains centered, limiting unnecessary dispersion. And reduced dispersion allows attention to remain more cohesive within its own boundaries. There is also a quiet shift in how anticipation operates. Normally, anticipation continuously projects forward, generating small predictive simulations of what might follow. This creates a subtle background activity that keeps attention partially engaged with what has not yet occurred. But when attention is anchored to something that does not require predictive adjustment, that forward projection becomes less active, not absent but reduced in intensity. Honey does not require anticipation to remain coherent. It does not change in ways that demand continuous forecasting, so the mind relaxes some of its predictive load when holding it in awareness. This reduction in forward modeling contributes to a sense of mental space that feels less crowded by internal simulation. At a more fundamental level, what is occurring is a redistribution of cognitive effort. Less energy is spent on reorientation, prediction, and interpretation. More energy remains available for sustained presence within a stable frame of awareness. And that sustained presence gradually changes the perceived texture of thought. It becomes less segmented by internal transitions, less interrupted by interpretive recalibration, more continuous in its unfolding. Honey, in this sense, is not functioning as content to be analyzed. It functions as a structural example of how stability behaves when it is not constantly disrupted by variability. And that structural example does not require active engagement to influence perception. It operates through consistency alone. As attention continues to rest within this consistency, thinking begins to adopt a slightly different rhythm, less reactive to shifts, less dependent on frequent redefinition, more able to remain within a single coherent field of awareness without fragmentation. And in that condition, cognition does not simplify itself. It organizes itself more smoothly, not through force, not through reduction, but through the quiet absence of interruption that allows continuity to remain intact long enough to be fully experienced as a single, stable flow. And as that stable flow continues to hold its shape in awareness, something even more subtle begins to surface, something that is not about thinking differently, but about noticing how little effort is actually required for thinking to remain coherent when it is not constantly interrupted. Because at a deeper level, much of mental strain is not created by thought itself. It is created by repeated interruption of thought before it completes its natural arc. When attention is fragmented, each emerging idea is cut short, redirected, or partially replaced before it fully integrates into the broader field of awareness. This creates a kind of unfinished mental residue, a sense that cognition is always slightly incomplete, always slightly mid-transition. But when attention is held within a stable reference, something like the concept of honey in its consistent, non-reactive form, that pattern of interruption begins to reduce, not because thoughts are controlled more tightly, but because they are no longer displaced as frequently. And in the absence of displacement, thoughts are allowed to complete themselves internally. They arise, develop, and dissolve without being forcibly redirected. This alone changes the internal texture of cognition. There is also a shift in how transitions are experienced. Normally, transitions between thoughts feel instantaneous, almost invisible. But in a more continuous state of attention, those transitions begin to feel less like jumps and more like gradients. One idea gently fades while another begins to form, without a clear boundary between them. This gradient-like movement reduces the sensation of mental discontinuity. Experience feels less like switching between separate rooms and more like moving through a single connected space with varying density. Honey, as a conceptual anchor, supports this because it does not introduce sharp cognitive edges. Its meaning does not require abrupt reclassification. It does not force attention to reset its interpretive frame. It remains structurally consistent across duration. And structural consistency reduces the need for segmentation. When something does not change in a way that demands re-evaluation, the mind stops carving experience into discrete interpretive units as frequently. There is also an important effect in how internal observation changes under these conditions. Instead of watching thoughts as separate objects passing through awareness, attention begins to register them more as fluctuations within a continuous field, not isolated events, but variations in intensity, density, and direction within a shared cognitive environment. This shift is subtle, but it changes the relationship between observer and thought. Thoughts feel less like external interruptions and more like internal variations of the same underlying process. Honey contributes to this reframing by offering a model of integrated structure. It does not behave like a collection of separate properties. It behaves like a unified system in which each property supports the others. And when attention aligns with that kind of structure, it becomes less inclined to isolate mental events unnecessarily. There is also a quiet reduction in what could be called interpretive urgency. This is the tendency of the mind to immediately assign meaning, categorize relevance, and determine next steps for every emerging impression. In fast, fragmented cognition, this happens almost continuously. But when attention is anchored to something stable and non-demanding, interpretive urgency decreases, not because interpretation stops, but because it is no longer triggered as frequently or as intensely. Honey does not require rapid categorization to remain understandable. Its meaning is not dependent on immediate classification. It can remain present in awareness without activating strong interpretive pressure. This allows attention to remain in a more observational mode, not passive, but less reactive, less compelled to resolve every incoming impression immediately. There is also a subtle change in how continuity is internally maintained. In fragmented states, continuity must be actively reconstructed after each interruption. The mind stitches together a sense of ongoing experience from discrete moments. But when interruptions decrease, continuity becomes less of a constructed process and more of a natural condition. It does not need to be rebuilt as often because it is not being broken as frequently. Honey, as a reference point, reinforces this by not introducing discontinuities in its conceptual behavior. It remains consistent across observation, and consistency reduces the need for cognitive stitching. At this stage, attention begins to feel less like a sequence of efforts and more like a steady presence that occasionally shifts focus without losing its underlying continuity. And that shift is important because when attention is experienced as continuous rather than fragmented, mental load decreases without any reduction in clarity. There is also a quiet effect on internal pacing. Without frequent interruptions, cognition begins to adopt a more even distribution of processing over time. Instead of bursts of rapid interpretation followed by pauses, there is a smoother progression of awareness. This even distribution reduces internal spikes of cognitive demand, and when demand becomes more evenly spread, mental experience feels less volatile. Honey aligns with this because it is itself a system defined by gradual processes rather than sudden changes. Its formation, stability, and behavior all reflect extended temporal distribution of activity. And when attention aligns with a temporally distributed model, it begins to adopt similar pacing internally, not through imitation, but through reduced contrast between stimulus and processing speed. There is also a subtle change in how background thoughts behave. Normally, background thoughts are constantly being generated and evaluated in parallel with primary focus. They often remain partially active, contributing to a sense of cognitive crowding. But in a more continuous mode of attention, these background processes begin to lose intensity. They still arise, but they do not escalate as frequently into competing streams of focus. They remain peripheral rather than intrusive. Honey contributes to this by providing a central, non-demanding focal point. Because it does not require intense interpretive engagement, it does not amplify peripheral cognitive activity. Instead, it allows awareness to remain centered without fragmentation into competing layers. There is also a deeper structural observation. that becomes clearer here. Honey is not stable because it resists change. It is stable because change within it is already fully integrated into its structure. There is no unresolved internal conflict between its components, and systems without internal conflict require less maintenance in perception. They do not force attention to constantly reconcile inconsistencies. When the mind engages with that kind of structure, it begins to reduce its own tendency to generate unnecessary internal conflict between thoughts, not by suppressing variation, but by allowing variation to exist without immediate opposition. At this point, cognition becomes less about managing multiple competing elements and more about observing a unified field that contains variation without fragmentation. And that unified field does not need to be held tightly. It maintains itself through continuity rather than control. So attention becomes less effortful in a very specific way, not because it is inactive, but because it is no longer repeatedly restarting its own organization. Honey, as a conceptual presence, remains consistent enough to support that continuity without requiring active reinforcement. And as that continuity stabilizes, thought does not become quieter in volume. It becomes quieter in structure, less divided, less interrupted, more evenly sustained across its own unfolding, without needing to constantly re-establish coherence at every transition. And as this steadier continuity holds, something even more refined begins to surface in the way awareness relates to its own movement. It is no longer about observing honey as an example of stability. It becomes about noticing how stability itself changes the shape of attention when it is sustained long enough without interruption. Because attention, when left without frequent disruption, does not remain static. It reorganizes, but it does so in a quiet way, without drawing attention to the fact that reorganization is occurring. One of the first things that becomes noticeable is that mental transitions begin to lose their sharpness, not their existence, but their definition. Instead of clearly separated shifts from one thought to another, there is a gradual overlapping of mental states. One impression fades while another begins forming before the first has fully dissolved. This overlapping does something subtle. It reduces the perception of gaps between thoughts, and those gaps are often where mental instability is most noticeable. Not because they are problematic, but because they are interpreted as interruptions in continuity. When those gaps soften, continuity becomes less something that has to be actively maintained. It becomes the default condition of awareness. Honey, as a conceptual anchor, supports this condition not by adding complexity, but by maintaining internal uniformity across time. It does not require redefinition. It does not introduce contradiction that would force segmentation, and because of that, it reduces the cognitive need to repeatedly restart interpretive framing. There is also a subtle shift in how the mind handles incoming impressions when interruption decreases. Instead of immediately categorizing each thought as separate and complete, awareness begins to hold multiple impressions within a single contextual field, not as confusion, but as layered presence. This layering is important because it allows thoughts to coexist without competing for immediate resolution. They can remain partially active without demanding closure. And when closure is not demanded immediately, cognition becomes less pressured. It no longer operates under the constant need to finalize meaning at every step. Instead, meaning can remain open for longer durations without generating tension. Honey reflects this in its own structural behavior. It does not require immediate classification to remain coherent. Its properties are stable regardless of how long they are observed, and that stability reduces the urgency of interpretation. There is also a quiet transformation in how internal sequencing is experienced. Normally, thought follows a linear progression, one idea leading directly to another, through association or logic. But in a more continuous mode of attention, sequencing becomes less rigid. Ideas do not strictly follow each other in a chain. They emerge within a shared field and overlap in subtle ways, influenced by proximity rather than strict order. This reduces the sensation of forced mental progression. Thinking feels less like moving from point A to point B and more like unfolding within a space where multiple points are already present. Honey conceptually aligns with this because it does not present itself as a stepwise process to be reconstructed. It is immediately available as a whole structure of understanding. There is no need to traverse it sequentially in order to grasp its basic coherence. And when something is understood as a whole rather than through sequential assembly, cognitive effort decreases in a very specific way. The mind does not need to maintain strict ordering to preserve meaning. There is also a subtle reduction in what could be called interpretive branching. In typical cognition, each idea can generate multiple associative branches, each requiring brief evaluation before one is followed more strongly than the others. This branching creates internal complexity, even when it is not consciously noticed. But when attention is anchored to something stable and non-expansive, like honey as a conceptual field, branching activity becomes less pronounced. Associations still occur, but they do not escalate as frequently into competing directions of focus. They remain peripheral rather than central, and that reduces internal dispersion. At this point, awareness begins to feel more centralized without becoming narrow. It holds a stable core of focus, while still allowing peripheral awareness to exist without fragmentation. Honey contributes to this by remaining low in associative volatility. It does not trigger rapid expansion into unrelated conceptual domains. It remains bounded within a consistent interpretive range, and bounded systems are easier for attention to hold without fragmentation, because they do not require constant boundary reconstruction. There is also a quiet change in how mental weight is experienced. In more fragmented cognition, each thought carries a sense of urgency proportional to how quickly it must be resolved or integrated. This creates uneven distribution of cognitive load. But in a more continuous state, where interruptions are reduced, mental weight becomes more evenly distributed. Thoughts feel less like pressing demands and more like passing elements within a shared environment. Honey reflects this through its physical behavior as well. Its movement is not abrupt or high energy. It shifts slowly, maintaining cohesion even while in motion, and that cohesion reduces perceived volatility. When attention aligns with such a pattern, internal processing begins to reflect similar stability, not by copying structure, but by reducing contrast between cognitive activity and perceptual expectation. There is also a deeper shift in how awareness perceives its own background state. Normally, background cognition operates as a subtle layer of ongoing interpretation, quiet, continuous, often unnoticed. But when attention stabilizes around a consistent reference, that background layer becomes less active, not silent, just less dominant. And as it recedes, foreground awareness becomes clearer without becoming more intense. Clarity here does not come from amplification. It comes from reduction of internal overlap. Honey supports this by minimizing internal ambiguity in its conceptual presence. It does not require simultaneous interpretation from multiple competing perspectives. Its structure is cohesive enough to be held without interpretive conflict. And reduced conflict within awareness leads to reduced cognitive tension. There is also a subtle temporal effect that becomes more noticeable under these conditions. Time does not feel compressed into rapid sequences of mental events. Instead, it feels more distributed. Moments are less densely packed with internal transitions. This distribution changes how continuity is experienced. It becomes less something that must be reconstructed and more something that is simply present. And when continuity is present without effort, attention does not need to constantly verify its own stability. It can remain within experience without repeatedly confirming its structure. Honey, in this sense, functions as a model of non-disruptive continuity, a system that remains itself without requiring internal reorganization to maintain coherence. And that absence of required reorganization is what gradually influences the pacing of thought, not by slowing it, but by removing the need for constant recalibration. So as this continues, awareness begins to feel less divided between moments of interpretation and moments of transition. Instead, everything begins to feel part of a single, continuous unfolding process that does not require frequent interruption to remain coherent. Thoughts still arise, Perception still shifts, awareness still moves, but the underlying structure remains stable enough that none of these movements disrupt the sense of continuity that holds them together. And as this continuity holds its ground a little longer, something even more subtle begins to emerge, not in the content of thought, but in the pressure behind thought itself, because most mental activity carries a quiet background pressure to keep moving forward, to resolve, to finish, to reach the next point. But when attention stays anchored to something structurally stable, like the slow, non-reactive concept of honey, that pressure begins to lose intensity, not by being suppressed, but by becoming unnecessary. The mind slowly stops treating every internal movement as something that must lead somewhere quickly. Instead, thoughts begin to exist with less obligation attached to them. They no longer feel like unfinished tasks. They feel more like temporary formations within awareness that do not require immediate direction. And this change is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It appears as a reduction in urgency that was never consciously noticed in the first place. There is also a shift in how cognitive tightness is experienced. In more fragmented states, attention often contracts around individual thoughts, holding them with subtle tension in order to maintain clarity. That contraction creates a feeling of mental density, too many points of focus competing within a narrow space. But as continuity increases, that contraction begins to ease. Attention no longer needs to hold ideas tightly to preserve them. They remain stable without being grasped as firmly. This creates a different quality of awareness, less compressed, more evenly distributed across what is present. Honey, as a reference structure, contributes to this easing by not requiring interpretive effort to remain stable in awareness. It does not change its internal identity depending on how closely it is observed. It remains consistent whether held lightly or considered in depth, and that consistency reduces the need for cognitive tightening. There is also a quiet transformation in how mental edges are perceived. Normally, thoughts are experienced with distinct boundaries, clear beginnings and endings, but in a more continuous mode of attention, those boundaries begin to soften into transitions rather than separations. One thought does not fully stop before the next begins. Instead, there is a gradual overlap in which both are partially present for a brief span of awareness. This overlap reduces the sensation of interruption, and reduced interruption changes the felt structure of thinking itself. It becomes less like discrete steps and more like a flowing gradient of awareness states. Honey reflects this behavior in a different form. Its structure is not segmented into parts that operate independently. It is a unified substance where properties are interdependent rather than isolated. Viscosity, stability, density, resistance, all expressed simultaneously rather than sequentially. And when attention aligns with something that does not require segmentation to be understood, it begins to reduce its own tendency to segment experience unnecessarily. There is also a subtle shift in how mental effort distribution changes. In fragmented cognition, effort is uneven. Some moments require high processing load, followed by moments of partial release, then another spike of adjustment. This uneven distribution creates internal fluctuations in perceived mental energy. But when attention remains with a stable reference, effort becomes more evenly spread, not eliminated, just less volatile in its application. Honey supports this by maintaining a consistent conceptual load. It does not fluctuate in interpretive demand. It does not suddenly become more complex or less coherent depending on duration of focus. That predictability reduces spikes in cognitive effort. There is also an important change in how awareness relates to uncertainty. In more reactive thinking, uncertainty is often treated as something that must be immediately resolved or reduced. But in a continuous attentional state, uncertainty can exist without generating immediate tension. It becomes something that is simply held within the field of awareness, rather than actively corrected. Honey contributes to this indirectly because it does not introduce interpretive instability. It does not demand rapid clarification. Its meaning remains stable enough that uncertainty does not escalate around it. And when uncertainty does not escalate, cognitive urgency decreases. There is also a shift in how background mental activity behaves. Normally, there is a constant low-level generation of associations, interpretations, and anticipatory simulations running alongside primary focus. This background activity often contributes to a sense of cognitive fullness or subtle overload. But when attention stabilizes, this background layer becomes less intrusive. It does not stop, but it loses dominance. Foreground awareness becomes clearer not by increasing intensity, but by reducing overlap from secondary processes. Honey contributes to this by occupying attention in a way that does not trigger extensive associative branching. It remains conceptually contained, and contained concepts reduce the spread of background activation. There is also a quieter change in how continuity itself is experienced. Rather than being something constructed from memory after each interruption, continuity begins to feel inherent, as if experience is not being stitched together, but simply unfolding without significant breaks. This reduces the cognitive labor involved in maintaining a sense of ongoingness. The mind no longer has to repeatedly confirm that experience is continuous. It simply remains continuous by default. Honey reflects this by not introducing discontinuities in its conceptual behavior. It does not break its identity across time. It remains the same structure, regardless of duration of attention, and that sameness reduces the need for mental reconstruction. There is also a subtle reduction in what could be called interpretive layering. In fragmented cognition, each thought is often processed through multiple interpretive passes: initial recognition, contextual evaluation, associative expansion, and integration. But in a more continuous state, some of these layers become less pronounced, not removed, but compressed into a more immediate understanding. This reduces the number of internal steps required to hold a thought coherently. Honey supports this by being easily grasped as a unified concept without requiring multi-layered interpretation to remain stable in awareness. And when fewer interpretive layers are needed, cognitive processing becomes less segmented. At this point, awareness begins to feel less like a sequence of mental operations and more like a single ongoing presence that occasionally shifts form without losing continuity. Thoughts still arise, but they do not feel like interruptions to a baseline state. They feel like variations within it, and that change is subtle but significant because it alters the fundamental assumption that thinking must be constantly reinitiated. Instead, thinking begins to feel continuous by default, not accelerated, not simplified, just less interrupted in its natural unfolding. And within that unfolding, honey remains as a quiet reference for how stability can exist without effort, how continuity can persist without reinforcement, and how awareness can remain active without fragmentation, all at the same time, without needing to be held together consciously to remain intact. And as this steady continuity persists, something even more refined begins to reveal itself, not as a new idea, but as a shift in how awareness recognizes its own internal background. Because what often goes unnoticed in ordinary thinking is not the thoughts themselves, but the constant micro-adjustments happening between them. Tiny recalibrations, subtle reorientations, quiet shifts in focus that keep experience from ever fully settling into one uninterrupted field. When attention is frequently redirected, these micro-adjustments accumulate into a sense of mental busyness that is not always obvious in content, but is felt in structure. The mind feels active, not because of what it is thinking, but because of how often it is restabilizing itself. But when a stable reference is held, something like the concept of honey in its consistent, low volatility form, those adjustments begin to reduce in frequency, not because awareness becomes passive, but because it no longer needs to constantly re-establish its interpretive footing. And as that need decreases, something subtle happens in the architecture of perception. The background layer of cognition becomes less segmented. Instead of constantly realigning itself with each new thought, it begins to maintain a more continuous alignment across multiple thoughts. This creates a quieter internal environment, not silent, but less interrupted by invisible transitions. Honey contributes to this condition because it does not introduce instability into attention. It does not demand reinterpretation each time it is considered. Its meaning remains structurally constant regardless of duration of focus, and structural constancy reduces the frequency of cognitive recalibration. When recalibration is not repeatedly triggered, attention begins to experience itself as more stable by default. There is also a shift in how mental resolution behaves under these conditions. In fragmented cognition, resolution is often treated as something that must occur immediately after each thought appears. Each idea is expected to be processed, categorized, and either integrated or dismissed before the next one fully arrives. But in a more continuous mode of attention, resolution becomes less immediate and less compulsory. Thoughts can remain partially unresolved without creating tension. They can exist in a state of soft openness without demanding closure. This reduces internal pressure significantly, because pressure often arises from the requirement to finalize meaning too quickly. Honey, as a conceptual field, does not introduce strong demands for closure. It does not force interpretation into a single fixed outcome. It remains stable, even when observed without analytical completion. And that stability allows the mind to relax its need for immediate resolution. There is also a subtle transformation in how temporal awareness is structured. Normally, experience is passed into sequential units. What just happened? What is happening now? What is expected next? This segmentation creates a layered sense of time that requires constant updating. But when attention is less frequently interrupted, those temporal divisions begin to blur slightly. The boundary between past and present impressions becomes less rigid. Instead of sharply defined temporal markers, there is a smoother continuity of unfolding awareness. Honey supports this indirectly by not producing changes that require temporal reclassification. It remains consistent across observation, reducing the need to repeatedly re-anchor awareness in time. And when temporal anchoring becomes less frequent, the experience of continuity becomes more dominant than the experience of sequence. There is also a quiet change in how cognitive load distributes itself across awareness. In more reactive states, load is unevenly distributed. Spikes of high processing demand followed by periods of partial release. This unevenness contributes to the feeling of mental fluctuation. But in a more stable attentional state, load becomes more evenly distributed, not eliminated, but spread across a wider field of processing rather than concentrated in sharp bursts. Honey contributes to this by maintaining a consistent interpretive demand. It does not fluctuate in complexity depending on focus. Its structure remains evenly accessible across duration of attention, and that even accessibility reduces cognitive spikes. There is also an important shift in how associative processes behave. In typical cognition, each thought can trigger rapid chains of association that expand outward into multiple directions. These associative branches often compete for attention, creating subtle internal dispersion. But when attention is anchored to something stable and non-expansive, associative branching becomes less intense. Connections still occur, but they remain within a narrower range of relevance. This reduces cognitive scattering, not by limiting thought, but by reducing unnecessary expansion. Honey naturally supports this because it does not strongly activate broad associative networks. It remains conceptually contained, and containment reduces dispersion. There is also a deeper structural change in how awareness handles continuity of identity. Normally, the mind repeatedly reaffirms that it is still engaged in the same stream of experience after each shift in thought. This reaffirmation is subtle but constant. When interruptions decrease, that reaffirmation becomes less necessary. Continuity is no longer something that must be reconstructed after each transition. It becomes an implicit condition of awareness itself. Honey reflects this by maintaining identity across all states of observation. It does not require redefinition to remain recognizable. Its coherence persists without reinforcement, and that persistence reduces the cognitive need for repeated self-orientation. There is also a quiet reduction in what might be called interpretive friction. This refers to the subtle resistance that arises when multiple possible interpretations of a thought compete for resolution. In fragmented cognition, this friction is frequent and often unnoticed. But when attention is anchored to a stable reference, interpretive friction decreases because fewer competing interpretations are generated at once. Honey does not introduce strong ambiguity that demands resolution. Its meaning is stable enough that interpretation does not fracture into competing directions, and reduced interpretive friction leads to smoother cognitive flow. At this stage, awareness begins to feel less like a system constantly managing transitions and more like a continuous field in which transitions occur without disrupting underlying stability. Thoughts still emerge, but they no longer feel like discrete interruptions. They feel like variations within an ongoing structure that does not need to be rebuilt repeatedly, and that structural continuity is what gradually changes the perceived nature of thinking itself. It becomes less segmented, less reactive, less dependent on constant internal reorganization. Honey remains present in this framework, not as an object of focus, but as a stabilizing example of how coherence can exist without effortful maintenance, a quiet demonstration that continuity does not need to be constructed moment by moment. It can simply remain, as long as interruption does not dominate the field of awareness. And as this quieter form of continuity holds steady, something even more refined begins to appear in the background of awareness. Something that is not about thinking less, but about noticing how thinking organizes itself when it is no longer repeatedly disrupted. Because what starts to become apparent is that the mind does not naturally operate in isolated fragments. It only appears fragmented when attention is repeatedly interrupted before each internal movement has time to complete its natural shape. When those interruptions decrease even slightly, cognition begins to reveal a different underlying behavior. Thoughts no longer feel like separate events competing for attention. They begin to feel like phases within a single unfolding process. Each phase flows into the next without requiring a sharp break to mark transition. This is where a subtle change in perception occurs. The mind is no longer primarily aware of new thoughts arriving. Instead, it becomes aware of a continuous unfolding that contains internal variation without fragmentation. Honey, as a stable conceptual reference, supports this shift because it does not demand cognitive segmentation in order to remain understood. It does not force attention to divide it into parts to maintain coherence. Its structure remains unified regardless of how long it is held in awareness. And when something can be held as a unified structure without breakdown, the mind gradually reduces its tendency to divide experience unnecessarily. There is also a quiet change in how internal emphasis behaves. In more fragmented cognition, emphasis shifts rapidly between competing thoughts. Each new idea temporarily becomes central before being replaced by another. This creates a subtle oscillation of importance within awareness. But when attention stabilizes, emphasis becomes less volatile. Rather than constantly shifting center points, awareness begins to maintain a more even distribution of relevance across multiple impressions. Nothing becomes overly dominant. Nothing is prematurely excluded. Instead, experience is held within a more balanced internal field. Honey contributes to this balance by not introducing strong hierarchical meaning structures. It does not force attention to prioritize one aspect of it over another in order to understand it. Its properties are already integrated, so no internal competition is required to interpret it. And when interpretive competition decreases, cognitive tension decreases with it. There is also a subtle restructuring of how mental continuity is maintained over time. Normally, continuity is reconstructed repeatedly after each shift in thought, as if awareness is stitching together separate moments into a coherent stream. This stitching process is usually invisible, but constant. However, when interruptions become less frequent, continuity begins to feel less constructed and more inherent. It is no longer something that must be rebuilt after each transition. It is something that simply remains present beneath transitions. Honey reflects this because it does not change in a way that disrupts its identity across time. It remains structurally consistent regardless of how often it is revisited in awareness. And that consistency reduces the need for constant mental reconstruction of coherence. There is also a quiet shift in how interpretive demand is distributed across cognition. In more reactive states, each thought carries an implicit demand for analysis, classification, or response. Even neutral impressions can feel slightly charged with the need for processing, but in a more continuous state, that implicit demand begins to fade. Thoughts can appear without immediately requiring interpretive action. They are allowed to remain in awareness without being processed into conclusions right away. This reduces the overall intensity of cognitive engagement without reducing clarity. Honey supports this by remaining conceptually low demand. It does not force rapid interpretation or decision-making. It can be held in awareness without activating strong cognitive response cycles. And when response cycles are less frequently triggered, mental pacing naturally becomes more even. There is also an important change in how associative expansion behaves. Normally, each idea can branch outward into multiple related concepts, forming a network of rapid connections. This expansion can create a sense of mental density, especially when many associations occur simultaneously. But when attention is anchored to something stable and non-expansive, like honey as a conceptual field, associative branching becomes more contained. Connections still occur, but they remain closer to the central reference point rather than spreading widely. This containment reduces cognitive dispersion, not by limiting thought, but by reducing unnecessary outward proliferation. Honey naturally supports this because it does not strongly activate wide associative networks. It remains centered within a narrow interpretive range, and that centeredness allows attention to remain more unified rather than distributed across multiple conceptual directions. There is also a subtle shift in how cognitive rhythm is perceived. In fragmented cognition, rhythm is irregular. Bursts of activity followed by brief pauses, followed again by rapid shifts. This irregularity contributes to a sense of mental instability, even when nothing is externally changing. But in a more continuous state, rhythm becomes more uniform, not perfectly constant, but less erratic. Transitions between thoughts become smoother, less abrupt, more evenly spaced. Honey contributes to this by existing as a process that is itself rhythmically consistent. Its formation, structure, and behavior do not involve abrupt accelerations or sudden collapses. It evolves through steady, distributed activity over time. And when attention aligns with something rhythmically stable, it begins to adopt similar internal pacing. There is also a deeper observation about how attention relates to complexity under these conditions. Complexity does not disappear, but it becomes easier to hold without fragmentation. Instead of being broken into separate interpretive tasks, complexity is experienced as a unified structure with internal variation. Honey exemplifies this by being chemically and structurally complex, while remaining perceptually simple. It does not require decomposition into parts for coherence to be maintained in awareness. And when complexity is experienced without forced decomposition, cognitive effort decreases significantly. At this point, awareness begins to feel less like a system managing multiple competing processes and more like a single continuous field in which variation unfolds without disruption. Thoughts still arise, interpretation still occurs, attention still shifts, but none of these movements disrupt the underlying continuity that holds them together. And that continuity becomes the most stable feature of experience itself, not as something constructed, but as something that remains when interruption is no longer dominant. Honey, in this context, is not the focus. It is the quiet example of how stability behaves when it is not repeatedly disturbed, a reference for continuity that does not require effort to maintain and does not break when attention moves within it. And as this continuity settles even more deeply into the background of awareness, something quieter still begins to take shape, something that is not immediately noticeable until attention has remained in this steady condition long enough for its own habits to become visible. Because at this point, what stands out is not what the mind is thinking, but how rarely it needs to reposition itself while thinking. That constant internal reorientation, which usually goes unnoticed, begins to fade into the background. And when that fading happens, cognition takes on a different quality. It no longer feels like a sequence of repeated resets. It feels more like an uninterrupted presence that occasionally changes direction without losing its underlying stability. Honey, as a conceptual anchor, contributes to this shift by remaining internally consistent, regardless of how it is revisited. It does not introduce structural surprises that would require the mind to rebuild its interpretive frame. Its identity stays intact across duration of attention, which reduces the need for repeated cognitive re-establishment. And when re-establishment becomes less frequent, awareness begins to experience itself as less fragmented across time. Instead of repeatedly returning to a baseline after each shift in thought, It remains within a continuous baseline that does not need reconstruction. There is also a subtle change in how mental spacing behaves. In more reactive cognition, thoughts are spaced unevenly. Some arrive in clusters, others appear in isolation, and the gaps between them often feel irregular. This irregular spacing contributes to a sense of instability, even if the content itself is neutral. But in a more continuous attentional state, spacing begins to even out, not in a mechanical sense, but in a perceptual one. Thoughts feel more evenly distributed across awareness, with fewer abrupt transitions between high activity and low activity. Honey supports this by not introducing variability that would force attention to adjust its spacing patterns. It remains steady in its conceptual load, allowing perception to maintain a more uniform rhythm of engagement, and that uniformity reduces internal contrast between moments of thought and moments of transition. The boundary between them becomes less pronounced. There is also a deeper shift in how cognitive load awareness functions. Normally, the mind is only partially aware of how much effort it is using at any given moment. But in fragmented states, that effort tends to fluctuate more visibly in retrospect. Some thoughts feel heavier, others lighter, depending on how much reinterpretation they required. When continuity increases, those fluctuations begin to flatten, not because effort disappears, but because it is no longer concentrated in sharp spikes tied to constant re-evaluation. Honey contributes to this flattening by remaining cognitively stable. It does not demand escalating interpretive effort over time. It remains equally accessible whether held briefly or sustained in awareness. And that equal accessibility reduces the contrast between different levels of cognitive engagement. There is also a quiet transformation in how awareness perceives mental distance. In fragmented cognition, thoughts often feel separated by subtle distances. One idea feels far from another due to the effort required to transition between them. But when transitions become smoother, that sense of distance reduces. Ideas feel closer together, not because they are merging, but because the path between them no longer requires significant cognitive effort to traverse. Honey reinforces this by not introducing conceptual gaps that require bridging. It remains internally continuous, so attention does not need to construct pathways between separate interpretations of it. And when fewer pathways are needed, mental structure feels more unified. There is also a subtle shift in how interpretive momentum behaves. In more reactive cognition, each thought carries forward momentum into the next, often pulling attention rapidly into new associations. This creates a sense of acceleration in mental activity, even when the content is calm. But in a more stable state, that momentum becomes less forceful. Thoughts still lead to other thoughts, but the transitions feel less propelled and more gently unfolding. Honey contributes to this by not triggering strong associative acceleration. It does not push attention into rapid conceptual expansion. It remains centered, allowing transitions to occur without compulsion. And when compulsion decreases, cognition begins to feel less driven and more self-regulating. There is also a deeper change in how awareness relates to completeness. In fragmented thinking, completeness is something that must be achieved repeatedly. Each thought is processed until it feels resolved, then replaced by another incomplete segment. But in a continuous attentional field, completeness becomes less localized. It is no longer tied to individual thoughts being finished. Instead, it is experienced as an overall sense that awareness is not missing anything essential at any given moment. Honey supports this by not presenting partial structures that require completion to be understood. It is already complete in its conceptual form, regardless of how long it is observed. And when completeness is not tied to resolution cycles, cognitive pressure decreases. There is also a quiet reduction in what might be called interpretive layering delay. Normally, the mind processes thoughts in stages. First recognition, then contextual alignment, then integration into broader understanding. These stages often happen so quickly they are not consciously perceived. But when continuity increases, these layers begin to compress, not disappear, but merge into a more immediate sense of understanding that does not require extended internal sequencing. Honey allows this compression because its structure does not require multi-stage interpretation to remain coherent. It is accessible as a unified impression rather than a stepwise construct, and unified access reduces internal processing delay. There is also a subtle shift in how awareness handles unresolved background content. In more fragmented cognition, there is often a persistent sense of partially processed thoughts lingering in the background, competing for attention in subtle ways. But in a more continuous state, those background elements lose intensity. They still arise, but they do not accumulate the same sense of unresolved pressure. Honey contributes to this reduction by not generating strong, unresolved interpretive threads. It does not encourage branching narratives that remain open-ended in awareness. And when fewer unresolved threads exist, cognitive background noise decreases. At this point, awareness begins to feel less like a system managing multiple incomplete processes and more like a continuous field in which processes arise, stabilize briefly, and dissolve without leaving residual tension. Thoughts still appear, but they do not accumulate pressure. They do not demand constant reorganization. They do not fracture the underlying continuity of experience. And in that condition, honey remains present not as a focal object, but as a steady structural reference for how cognition can remain coherent without interruption, without fragmentation, and without the need for constant internal correction to sustain its own flow. And as this steadier cognitive flow continues, something even more subtle begins to emerge. Not in what is being observed, but in how observation itself stops needing to constantly justify its direction. Because in most ordinary mental activity, attention is not only moving, it is also explaining to itself why it is moving. Even when that explanation is not verbal, there is a continuous internal validation process happening in the background. A quiet sense that each shift in focus must have a reason, a purpose, a justification. But when attention remains anchored in something stable, like the slow, consistent conceptual presence of honey, this self-justification begins to loosen, not disappear, just loosen. And that loosening changes the texture of awareness in a very specific way. Attention no longer feels like it must constantly prove that it is correctly placed. It simply remains where it is, without the same level of internal verification. This reduces a subtle form of cognitive overhead that usually goes unnoticed. The mind is no longer dividing its resources between perception and continuous self-monitoring of perception. Honey supports this shift because it does not introduce interpretive instability that would trigger constant reassessment. Its meaning does not require correction over time. It remains structurally intact across sustained attention, which reduces the need for ongoing internal validation. And when validation demands decrease, awareness begins to feel less busy with itself, not quieter in content, but less involved in managing its own positioning. There is also a change in how mental transitions are internally registered. In more fragmented cognition, transitions feel like distinct events, clear separations between one thought ending and another beginning. Even if subtle, these separations create a rhythm of interruption. But as continuity strengthens, those transitions begin to lose their event-like quality. They become less noticeable as separate occurrences, and more like gradual inflections within a single continuous stream. One idea does not end abruptly before the next begins. Instead, it gently fades while another emerges in parallel, creating an overlapping field rather than a segmented chain. Honey contributes to this by not requiring cognitive reset points to remain coherent. It does not force attention to re-establish its interpretive frame when returning to it. It remains continuously recognizable without redefinition, and when reset points are less necessary, the experience of interruption weakens. There is also a subtle shift in how mental energy is distributed across time. In more reactive states, energy tends to cluster around moments of reinterpretation. Each shift in thought requires a brief surge of processing, followed by a drop in activity. This creates an uneven energetic rhythm that contributes to the feeling of mental fluctuation. But when attention stabilizes, those surges become less pronounced. Processing becomes more evenly distributed across ongoing awareness, rather than concentrated in bursts. Honey aligns with this because it does not require varying levels of cognitive effort depending on duration of engagement. Its interpretive demand remains relatively constant, and that constancy smooths out internal fluctuations in mental effort. There is also a quiet transformation in how awareness handles conceptual distance. Normally, different ideas feel separated not just by content, but by the effort required to move between them. This creates a sense of internal spacing that can feel uneven or fragmented. But when transitions require less effort, that spacing feels reduced. Ideas remain distinct, but not distant. They coexist within a shared field, rather than appearing as isolated points requiring traversal. Honey reinforces this by remaining conceptually unified. It does not fragment into sub-meanings that require bridging. Its structure is immediately accessible as a whole, and when fewer internal bridges are required, cognitive structure feels more integrated. There is also a subtle change in how anticipation behaves within awareness. In fragmented cognition, anticipation often runs ahead of current thought, generating projections about what comes next. This forward movement creates a background layer of continuous simulation. But when attention is anchored in something that does not require predictive adjustment, that forward simulation becomes less active, not absent, but less dominant. Honey does not require anticipation to remain understood. It does not change in ways that force constant prediction updates, so the mind reduces unnecessary forward modeling while it is held in awareness. And when forward modeling decreases, attention feels less pulled toward what is not yet present. There is also a deeper shift in how coherence is experienced. In reactive cognition, coherence must be actively maintained by continuously connecting new thoughts to previous ones. It is something constructed moment by moment, but in a more continuous state, coherence becomes less constructed and more inherent. It does not need to be repeatedly assembled because it is not being broken apart frequently. Honey reflects this because it does not lose its internal identity across time. Its structure remains coherent regardless of how often it is revisited mentally, and that persistent coherence reduces the need for constant cognitive stitching. There is also a quiet reduction in what might be called interpretive load layering. This refers to the stacking of multiple levels of interpretation on a single thought. Recognition, context mapping, implication tracing, and integration into broader understanding. In more fragmented states, these layers feel separate even if they occur rapidly. But in a more continuous attentional field, these layers begin to compress into a more immediate sense of understanding, not simplified understanding, just less separated internal processing. Honey allows this compression because it does not require multi-stage reconstruction to remain meaningful. Its coherence is immediately available at the surface level of perception, and when interpretation layers compress, cognitive effort becomes less segmented. There is also a subtle change in how mental background noise behaves. In ordinary cognition, there is a constant stream of low-intensity thoughts, associations, and partial interpretations running alongside primary focus. These background processes often contribute to a sense of subtle cognitive fullness. But when attention stabilizes, these background processes lose some of their intensity. They still exist, but they no longer compete as strongly for interpretive space. Honey contributes to this by occupying awareness in a way that does not stimulate wide associative branching. It remains centered, reducing peripheral cognitive activation. And reduced peripheral activation leads to a clearer internal field of awareness. At this stage, experience begins to feel less like a system managing multiple simultaneous processes and more like a single continuous presence in which variation arises naturally without disrupting underlying stability. Thoughts still appear, shifts still occur, attention still moves. But none of these movements fracture the continuity that holds them together. And that continuity, once noticed in this way, does not feel like something created. It feels like something that was always present beneath interruption, quietly maintaining coherence even when attention was too divided to recognize it directly. And as this underlying continuity becomes more recognizable, something even more subtle begins to shift. Something that is not about attention changing its object, but about attention slowly becoming less dependent on constant change to stay engaged. Because in most ordinary mental activity, engagement is often maintained through variation. A new thought appears, attention moves, a shift in idea occurs. Attention follows, a contrast emerges, attention sharpens. This constant reliance on variation creates a hidden expectation that awareness must always be responding to something different in order to feel active. But when attention is held within a stable reference like honey, steady, consistent, non-reactive in conceptual form, that expectation begins to soften. Engagement no longer depends on frequent novelty. It begins to sustain itself through continuity. And that shift quietly changes how mental presence feels from within. Instead of being pulled forward by differences, awareness begins to rest within sameness that still contains subtle variation. Not sameness as emptiness, but sameness as structural consistency that allows change to occur without disruption. Honey supports this because its identity does not rely on contrast to remain recognizable. It does not need to become something different in order to stay perceptible. It remains coherent within itself, regardless of how long it is held in attention. And when coherence does not depend on contrast, the mind no longer needs to constantly search for new differences to maintain engagement. There is also a subtle reduction in what could be described as attention recoil. This is the slight internal pull that happens after each shift in focus, when the mind restabilizes itself around a new point of reference. In fragmented cognition, this recoil is constant, even if unnoticed. But as continuity strengthens, that recoil becomes less pronounced. Transitions still happen, but they feel less like abrupt reorientation and more like gentle adjustments within a stable field. Honey contributes to this by not requiring strong cognitive repositioning when it is revisited. It remains structurally familiar without needing reintroduction, and familiarity without reorientation reduces the energetic cost of each attentional shift. There is also a change in how internal distance perception operates. Normally, different thoughts feel separated not only by content, but by the mental effort required to connect them. This creates a sense of separation that is experienced as cognitive distance. But when transitions become smoother, that distance compresses. Ideas remain distinct, but they no longer feel far apart. They exist closer together within the same uninterrupted field of awareness. Honey reinforces this compression by being conceptually unified, rather than fragmented into parts that require bridging. It does not introduce internal gaps that need to be cognitively crossed. And when fewer gaps exist, awareness feels more continuous in structure. There is also a quiet transformation in how mental pacing adjusts itself over time. In more reactive cognition, pacing is irregular. Fast bursts of processing followed by brief periods of reduced activity. This irregularity contributes to a sense of internal fluctuation, even when externally calm. But when attention stabilizes, pacing begins to smooth out. Processing does not disappear or slow artificially. It becomes more evenly distributed across the duration of awareness. Honey aligns with this because it does not introduce variability in interpretive demand. Its conceptual load remains consistent across time, reducing fluctuations in cognitive intensity. And when intensity becomes more evenly distributed, mental experience feels less volatile. There is also a subtle shift in how awareness relates to unfinished mental material. In fragmented cognition, there is often a background sense of incompletion, thoughts that feel partially processed or not fully integrated. These can create a low-level sense of cognitive residue, but in a more continuous attentional field, that residue becomes less pronounced. Thoughts are less likely to remain suspended in a partially unresolved state, because they are not interrupted as frequently during their unfolding. Honey contributes to this by not triggering rapid interpretive divergence. It does not encourage branching that leaves multiple unresolved paths active simultaneously. And when fewer unresolved branches exist, cognitive background tension decreases. There is also a deeper structural change in how continuity is perceived across multiple thoughts. Instead of continuity being something reconstructed after each shift, It begins to feel like the default environment in which shifts occur. Attention no longer needs to reconnect experience after each movement. Experience remains connected throughout movement. Honey reflects this by maintaining identity without interruption. It does not require reassembly after being revisited in thought. It remains the same conceptual structure regardless of temporal distance between observations, and that stability reduces the cognitive need for repeated reconnection. There is also a quiet reduction in what might be called interpretive layering separation. Normally, interpretation occurs in stacked stages: recognition, categorization, contextual placement, implication, and integration. These stages are often seamless in everyday thinking, but still structurally separate. When continuity increases, these layers begin to merge more tightly. The transitions between them become less noticeable, creating a more immediate sense of understanding. Honey supports this merging because it does not require deep decomposition to remain coherent. Its meaning is accessible without progressive breakdown into interpretive stages, and when fewer stages are needed, cognitive processing feels more unified. There is also a subtle shift in how attention handles multiplicity. In fragmented cognition, multiple thoughts often compete for central position, each attempting to become the primary focus. This competition creates internal friction, even when subtle. But in a more continuous state, multiplicity becomes less competitive. Multiple impressions can exist without needing to displace each other. They are held within the same field of awareness without hierarchical pressure. Honey contributes to this by not demanding exclusive focus for understanding. It can be held alongside other impressions without generating interpretive conflict. And when exclusivity pressure decreases, cognitive tension reduces. At this stage, awareness begins to feel less like a system switching between competing points of focus and more like a single continuous field in which multiple variations arise without disruption. Thoughts continue to appear, associations continue to form, attention continues to shift, but none of these movements break the underlying continuity that holds them together. And that continuity becomes less something that must be maintained and more something that is simply recognized as always already present beneath the movement of thought itself. And as that recognition settles more quietly into the background, something even more refined begins to appear, not as an additional layer of thought, but as a subtle reduction in the need to interpret every shift in awareness as significant. Because in ordinary cognition, even small internal changes tend to be treated as meaningful transitions. A thought appears, and the mind leans toward explanation. A sensation shifts, and attention briefly searches for cause. A new association forms, and there is a slight impulse to classify its relevance. This constant interpretive activity gives experience a sense of density that is not always proportional to what is actually occurring. Much of it comes from the mind treating every micro-movement as something requiring explanation. But when attention is anchored in a stable, low-volatility reference like honey, that interpretive reflex begins to soften, not because interpretation stops, but because fewer shifts are treated as demands for immediate meaning-making. And in that reduction, awareness begins to feel less activated by its own changes. Thoughts still arise, but they are less likely to trigger immediate internal commentary. They pass through awareness with less interpretive interruption. Honey supports this condition because it does not introduce uncertainty that requires constant clarification. Its conceptual identity remains stable regardless of duration of attention, and stability reduces the impulse to continuously reassess meaning. There is also a subtle shift in how mental sequencing behaves when interpretive pressure decreases. In fragmented cognition, sequencing often feels necessary and directional. One thought must lead to another in order for coherence to be maintained. But in a more continuous state, sequencing becomes less compulsory and more fluid. Thoughts no longer feel like steps that must be followed in a strict order. They feel more like overlapping regions within a shared field of awareness. The order is still present, but it is no longer rigid. Honey contributes to this by not requiring linear decomposition for comprehension. It does not need to be mentally traversed step by step in order to remain coherent. Its structure is immediately accessible as a whole, and when linear traversal is not required, mental sequencing becomes less constrained. There is also a quiet reduction in what could be described as cognitive correction cycles. These are the subtle internal adjustments the mind makes when a thought slightly deviates from expected coherence. In more reactive states, these corrections happen frequently and invisibly, constantly fine-tuning interpretation. But as continuity strengthens, the need for correction decreases. Thoughts are allowed more variability without triggering immediate internal adjustment. Honey supports this by remaining within a stable interpretive range. It does not introduce irregularities that would force continuous correction. Its conceptual behavior is consistent enough that awareness does not need to repeatedly adjust its understanding of it. And when correction cycles reduce, cognitive flow becomes smoother and less interrupted. There is also a change in how attention relates to duration itself. Normally, sustained focus requires effort to maintain because attention tends to drift or reorient frequently. But when a stable reference is present, sustaining attention becomes less effortful, not because attention is being forced, but because fewer internal disruptions are pulling it away. Honey contributes to this by providing a focal point that does not generate competing demands. It does not fragment attention into multiple interpretive directions. It remains unified in its presence within awareness, and unified presence reduces the frequency of attentional drift. There is also a subtle transformation in how mental continuity memory operates. This refers to the mind's ability to maintain a sense of ongoing experience across time without needing to actively reconstruct it after each shift. In fragmented cognition, continuity memory is repeatedly activated, stitching together separate moments into a coherent stream. But when interruption decreases, this stitching becomes less necessary. Continuity begins to feel inherent rather than constructed. Honey supports this because it does not disrupt its own conceptual identity across time. It remains recognizable without requiring mental reconstruction after each return to it. And when reconstruction is less needed, awareness feels more naturally continuous. There is also a quiet shift in how cognitive load is distributed across layers of awareness. In more reactive states, different layers of processing, perception, interpretation, association, often operate with noticeable separation. This separation contributes to a sense of internal complexity. But when continuity increases, these layers begin to align more closely. They do not merge completely, but they become less distinctly separated in felt experience. Honey contributes to this alignment by remaining simple in surface perception, while containing structural consistency beneath it. It does not force attention to divide itself across multiple interpretive layers in order to remain coherent, and reduced layering separation leads to smoother cognitive integration. There is also a subtle reduction in what might be called anticipatory overreach. This occurs when the mind projects forward too quickly, generating multiple potential interpretations of what might come next before the current thought has fully settled. In more stable attentional states, this overreach decreases. The mind still anticipates, but with less urgency and less expansion. Honey supports this by not requiring predictive adjustment for understanding. It does not shift in ways that demand rapid forecasting. Its behavior remains within a narrow range of expectation, and when prediction demands decrease, cognitive tension eases. There is also a deeper shift in how awareness perceives the boundary between thinking and non-thinking states. In fragmented cognition, this boundary feels more distinct. Moments of active thought, followed by moments of relative quiet. But in a more continuous state, that boundary becomes less defined. Thinking and non-thinking begin to feel like variations within the same ongoing field rather than separate conditions. Honey reflects this by remaining stable across both focused attention and passive awareness. It does not require active engagement to remain present in cognition, and that non-requirement reduces the perceived separation between different modes of awareness. At this point, experience begins to feel less like a sequence of mental events and more like a continuous environment in which events arise and dissolve without disrupting underlying stability. Thoughts still appear, shifts still occur, interpretation still functions, but none of these processes fracture the continuity that holds them together, and that continuity becomes the most stable feature of awareness itself. Not something actively maintained, but something recognized as always present beneath the movement, the variation, and the quiet unfolding of thought that continues without interruption. And as that recognition of continuity settles even further into the background, something more delicate begins to emerge, not as a new layer of thought, but as a gradual change in how the mind stops insisting on constant reinterpretation of itself. Because in ordinary cognition, there is a persistent, almost invisible habit of self-updating. Even when nothing significant changes, the mind quietly rechecks its own internal state. What am I thinking now? Has this shifted? Does this still hold? This internal checking is so habitual that it rarely feels like effort. Yet it creates a subtle undercurrent of cognitive motion that never fully rests. When attention remains anchored in a stable, non-disruptive reference like honey, that checking mechanism begins to loosen, not through suppression, but through reduced necessity. There is simply less need to confirm stability when stability is already being continuously experienced. And in that reduction, awareness begins to feel less like it is managing itself moment by moment. It becomes less self-referential in its monitoring, more simply present. Honey supports this condition because it does not introduce volatility that would require frequent reassessment. Its conceptual structure does not shift in ways that demand correction or reorientation. It remains consistently recognizable across sustained attention. And when recognition does not require repeated verification, cognitive energy is no longer spent on maintaining internal confirmation loops. There is also a subtle change in how transitions between thoughts are experienced at this stage. Instead of feeling like discrete replacements, one idea ending, another beginning, transitions begin to feel like slow dissolves. The ending of one thought is still slightly present as the next begins to form. This creates a layered overlap where continuity is not maintained by force, but by gentle persistence of residual awareness. Honey contributes to this effect by not imposing sharp conceptual boundaries. It does not require mental segmentation to remain understandable. Its identity persists across duration without needing redefinition at each return. And when boundaries become less rigid, transitions become less disruptive. There is also a quiet shift in how cognitive emphasis distributes itself. In more reactive states, emphasis tends to jump rapidly between thoughts, creating a sense of fluctuating importance. Each new idea briefly feels central before giving way to another. But as continuity stabilizes, emphasis becomes less volatile. Instead of constantly reassigning importance, awareness begins to maintain a more even field where multiple impressions can coexist without competing for dominance. Honey supports this by not requiring hierarchical interpretation. No single aspect of it demands prioritization over others in order to remain coherent. Its structure is integrated rather than segmented, and integration reduces the need for shifting emphasis. There is also a subtle transformation in how mental noise is perceived. In fragmented cognition, background thoughts often feel like interruptions, even when they are faint. They appear as minor disturbances within the main flow of attention. But when continuity increases, those background elements lose their disruptive quality. They are still present, but they no longer interrupt the coherence of awareness in the same way. Honey contributes to this by occupying awareness in a way that does not amplify peripheral associative activity. It remains conceptually centered, reducing expansion into unrelated mental branches. And when expansion is reduced, background activity loses intensity. There is also a deeper shift in how time is internally segmented. Normally, experience is divided into successive units, each moment replacing the previous one in a continuous chain. This segmentation is useful, but it also creates a subtle sense of fragmentation. When attention stabilizes, those divisions begin to soften. Moments are no longer felt as strictly separated units. Instead, they appear as variations within a continuous flow that does not require discrete marking to remain coherent. Honey reflects this by maintaining identity across time, without requiring reintroduction. It does not reset its meaning with each re-engagement. It remains continuously present in conceptual form, and continuous presence reduces temporal segmentation. There is also a quiet reduction in what could be described as interpretive latency. This refers to the brief delay between perception and understanding that arises when the mind must actively process and categorize incoming impressions. In more fragmented states, this latency is more pronounced, even if subtle. But when continuity increases, interpretation becomes more immediate, not because processing disappears, but because fewer intermediate steps are required. Honey allows for this immediacy because it does not require deep decomposition to remain coherent. Its structure is already integrated at the level of perception, reducing the need for layered interpretation, and reduced interpretive steps create smoother cognitive flow. There is also a subtle change in how awareness relates to unresolved mental content. In reactive cognition, unresolved thoughts often linger in the background, creating a sense of partial incompletion. But in a more continuous state, those unresolved elements lose intensity. They are less likely to accumulate pressure because they are not repeatedly interrupted and reactivated. Honey supports this by not generating strong, open-ended interpretive threads. It remains conceptually self-contained rather than expanding into unresolved chains of association. And when fewer unresolved threads persist, cognitive background tension decreases. There is also a quiet transformation in how awareness experiences its own stability. In fragmented cognition, stability is something that must be actively maintained through continuous reorientation. But in a more continuous state, stability begins to feel inherent rather than constructed. It is not something that is repeatedly achieved. It is something that is simply recognized as already present beneath shifting experience. Honey reflects this because its coherence does not depend on active maintenance. It remains stable across all moments of attention without requiring reconstruction. And when stability is inherent rather than maintained, cognitive effort decreases significantly. There is also a subtle shift in how associative networks behave. In more reactive cognition, associations expand rapidly outward, forming wide and sometimes competing networks of meaning. But in a more stable attentional field, those networks remain more contained. Associations still occur, but they tend to remain closer to the central focus, rather than spreading into unrelated domains. Honey supports this containment by not strongly activating broad associative expansion. It remains centered within a narrow interpretive field, and contained association reduces mental dispersion. At this stage, awareness begins to feel less like a system managing multiple competing layers of interpretation, and more like a continuous field in which thoughts arise, stabilize briefly, and dissolve without disrupting underlying coherence. Thoughts continue, interpretation continues, attention continues to shift, but none of these movements fracture the continuity that holds them together. And that continuity, once fully recognized in this way, does not feel like something created through effort. It feels like something that was always present beneath the fluctuations of thought, quietly sustaining coherence even when attention was too divided to notice it directly. And as that quiet recognition settles further into the structure of awareness, something even more subtle begins to surface, not as a change in thought itself, but as a change in how little resistance there is to letting thoughts simply pass through. Because in ordinary cognition, even calm cognition, there is often a faint tendency to hold onto each idea just long enough to confirm its place in the overall stream. A brief internal grip, a subtle stabilization, a momentary anchoring before release. But when continuity becomes more established, that micro-gripping begins to fade. Thoughts are no longer held with the same need for internal confirmation. They are allowed to form, exist briefly, and dissolve without being mentally secured in place. This creates a different kind of cognitive atmosphere, less like storage, more like flow. Honey supports this shift because it does not demand retention to remain meaningful. Its conceptual presence does not weaken when it is not actively analyzed. It remains stable, even when it is simply observed without engagement. And when meaning does not depend on holding, the mind begins to release its habitual grasping reflex. There is also a quiet change in how mental continuation pressure behaves. In fragmented cognition, each thought often carries a subtle pressure to extend itself, to lead somewhere, to evolve into something more structured, to justify its presence by becoming part of a chain. But in a more continuous state, that pressure reduces. Thoughts are no longer required to extend themselves in order to feel complete. They can remain self-contained within their brief appearance in awareness. Honey contributes to this by not requiring conceptual expansion to remain coherent. It does not need elaboration to maintain its identity in thought. Its structure is already complete in its immediate form, and when expansion is not required, mental pressure to continue diminishes. There is also a shift in how awareness handles the boundary between relevance and irrelevance. In more reactive states, relevance is constantly being recalculated. Each new thought is quickly assessed for importance, direction, or usefulness. But when continuity stabilizes, that constant recalculation slows, not because discernment disappears, but because fewer internal shifts require immediate classification. Honey supports this by remaining neutral in its interpretive demand. It does not strongly push awareness toward categorization or prioritization. It simply remains present within awareness, without forcing directional judgment, and reduced judgment frequency softens cognitive segmentation. There is also a subtle transformation in how mental background continuity is experienced. Normally, there is a faint sense that background thought is separate from foreground attention. Even when both are calm, they often feel like distinct layers. But as continuity increases, that separation becomes less distinct. Foreground and background begin to feel like variations within the same continuous field of awareness, rather than separate systems. Honey contributes to this by not dividing attention between competing interpretive demands. It remains singular in its conceptual presence, reducing layered separation in cognition. And when layers feel less distinct, awareness becomes more unified in structure. There is also a quiet reduction in what could be called interpretive redundancy. This refers to the repeated internal reprocessing of the same idea from slightly different angles, often without new information being added. In fragmented cognition, redundancy is common because the mind frequently rechecks meaning from multiple perspectives to ensure coherence. But in a more stable attentional field, redundancy decreases. Meaning does not need to be re-derived repeatedly once it has stabilized in awareness. Honey supports this by maintaining consistent interpretive accessibility. Its meaning does not shift depending on perspective, reducing the need for repeated reinterpretation. And when reinterpretation decreases, cognitive cycles shorten. There is also a subtle change in how mental transitions are internally weighted. In more reactive cognition, transitions between thoughts often feel significant, even when subtle. Each shift carries a slight sense of movement that must be registered and processed. But in a more continuous state, transitions lose some of their perceived weight. They become lighter, less emphasized, more like gentle reconfigurations within an ongoing field. Honey contributes to this by not introducing sharp conceptual discontinuities that would amplify transition awareness. It remains smooth in interpretive structure, reducing perceived boundary strength. And when boundaries weaken, transitions feel less disruptive. There is also a deeper shift in how attention relates to stability over time. In fragmented cognition, stability is something that must be repeatedly re-established after each shift in focus. It is fragile, constantly being rebuilt. But in a more continuous state, stability becomes less fragile. It does not require constant reinforcement because it is not being repeatedly broken. Honey reflects this because its conceptual identity remains intact across time without requiring reassembly. It does not decay in coherence when attention shifts away and returns, and that persistent coherence reduces the cognitive need for stabilization effort. There is also a quiet change in how associative movement behaves. In more reactive cognition, associations tend to branch rapidly outward, creating wide networks of related thoughts. This can increase complexity and internal dispersion. But in a more continuous state, associative movement becomes more contained. Connections still form, but they remain closer to the central reference rather than expanding into distant conceptual areas. Honey supports this containment by not strongly activating wide associative divergence. It remains centered within a narrow interpretive field, and contained association reduces cognitive scattering. At this stage, awareness begins to feel less like a system navigating multiple branching pathways and more like a continuous environment in which thoughts arise and dissolve without requiring navigation at all. There is movement, but not navigation. There is variation, but not fragmentation. There is change, but not disruption. And within that structure, honey remains present not as an object being examined, but as a steady example of how continuity behaves when it is not repeatedly interrupted by the need for correction, reinterpretation, or reconstruction, a quiet reference point for a mind that no longer needs to divide its own flow in order to remain coherent, because coherence is no longer something being built moment by moment, but something that remains continuously available beneath every unfolding thought. And as that sense of continuously available coherence deepens, something even more subtle begins to surface in awareness. Something that is easy to overlook precisely because it does not announce itself as a change. It is the gradual reduction of mental resistance to stillness inside movement. Because in ordinary experience, stillness is often associated with the absence of thought, while movement is associated with thinking itself. So the mind tends to treat these as separate states that must alternate. Either thinking happens or stillness happens. But in a more continuous attentional field, that separation begins to soften. Stillness is no longer something that only exists when thought is absent. It begins to appear within thinking itself. Thoughts continue to move, but they no longer fully disrupt the underlying quiet structure in which they arise. They pass through something that remains steady beneath their motion. Honey, as a conceptual reference, contributes to this perception because it does not require cognitive activation to remain present. It does not demand analysis, transformation, or reinterpretation to sustain its identity and awareness. It simply remains stable while attention moves through it. And when something can remain stable during movement, the mind begins to reconsider its assumption that movement and stillness must be opposites. There is also a subtle shift in how mental transitions are experienced at this stage. Instead of being perceived as breaks between thoughts, transitions begin to feel like internal adjustments within a single continuous structure. The mind is no longer switching from one state to another. It is gently reshaping within the same ongoing field. This reduces the sense of interruption that usually accompanies changes in focus. And when interruption perception decreases, continuity becomes more dominant than sequence. Honey supports this by maintaining conceptual identity without requiring discontinuity to preserve clarity. It does not reset its meaning when attention returns to it. It remains already present, already complete, already coherent, and that reduces the cognitive need to mark transitions as separate events. There is also a quiet change in how attention relates to internal spacing. Normally, thoughts feel spaced apart by subtle gaps of awareness. Moments where one idea ends and another has not yet fully formed. These gaps are often unnoticed, but they contribute to a sense of segmentation. But as continuity strengthens, those gaps begin to feel less distinct, not because they disappear, but because they lose their sharpness. They become part of the same continuous field, rather than separating units of experience. Honey contributes to this smoothing because it does not introduce conceptual fragmentation that would require resegmentation upon re-engagement. Its structure remains intact across time, reducing the need to re-establish boundaries between mental states. And when boundaries are less frequently reconstructed, experience feels more unified. There is also a subtle transformation in how cognitive background processing behaves. In typical mental activity, background processes continue to generate associations, predictions, and interpretations, even when attention is focused elsewhere. This creates a layered sense of simultaneous activity within awareness. But when continuity stabilizes, background processing begins to quiet, not by stopping, but by becoming less dominant relative to foreground awareness. Honey contributes to this by not stimulating wide associative expansion. It remains conceptually centered, reducing the activation of peripheral interpretive pathways. And when peripheral activation decreases, awareness feels less crowded internally. There is also a change in how mental resolution unfolds. In fragmented cognition, resolution is often experienced as a necessary endpoint for each thought, something that must be achieved before moving on. But in a more continuous state, Resolution becomes less strict. Thoughts do not always need to be fully resolved to remain stable within awareness. They can fade naturally without being explicitly completed. Honey supports this by not requiring interpretive closure to remain coherent. Its meaning does not depend on finalization. It remains stable even in open-ended observation. And when closure is not required, cognitive pressure decreases. There is also a quiet reduction in what could be called interpretive re-entry effort. This is the subtle work the mind performs when returning to a previously held idea after a brief absence of attention. In fragmented cognition, re-entry often involves re-establishing context and reconstructing meaning. But as continuity strengthens, re-entry becomes less effortful. The idea is already partially present, requiring less reconstruction to be understood again. Honey contributes to this by maintaining consistent conceptual structure across returns to attention. It does not require redefinition upon re-engagement. It remains immediately recognizable. And when re-entry effort decreases, cognitive flow becomes more seamless. There is also a subtle shift in how awareness handles multiplicity. In more reactive cognition, multiple thoughts often compete for central attention, creating internal friction as they attempt to dominate focus. But in a more continuous field, multiplicity becomes less competitive. Multiple impressions can coexist without needing to displace one another. They are held within the same awareness without hierarchical pressure. Honey supports this by not requiring exclusive focus to remain understood. It can be present alongside other impressions without generating interpretive conflict. And when exclusivity pressure reduces, cognitive tension softens. There is also a deeper transformation in how temporal awareness is structured. Instead of experience being divided into sharply separated moments, it begins to feel like a continuous unfolding where distinctions exist, but do not fracture the flow. Time is still perceived, but less as segmented units and more as a smooth gradient of ongoing change. Honey reflects this by maintaining continuity of identity across duration. It does not require temporal redefinition to remain coherent. It persists as a stable conceptual presence throughout shifting attention, and persistent presence reduces the felt segmentation of time. At this point, awareness begins to feel less like a sequence of mental operations and more like a continuous field in which operations occur without breaking the field itself. Thoughts arise, perception shifts, attention moves, but none of these movements disrupt the underlying continuity that holds them together. And that continuity no longer feels like something constructed through effort. It feels like something that remains naturally present whenever interruption is not dominant. A quiet structural constant beneath the changing surface of thought, gently sustaining coherence without needing to be actively maintained.